In a letter dated 22 January 1870, Mazzini wrote to Pike. Now, Albert Pike is this high mason who wrote the manual, if you like, of Scottish Freemasonry. He said the following: "We must allow all of the federations to continue just as they are. It must appear as things are as they were in the beginning, with their systems, their central authorities, and diverse modes of correspondence between high grades of the same right, organized as they are at present, but we must create a super right, which will remain unknown, to which we will call those Masons of high degree, whom we shall select. With regard to our brothers in Masonry, these men must be pledged to the strictest secrecy. Through this supreme right, we will govern all Freemasonry, which will become the one international center, the more powerful because its direction will be unknown." Now, Albert Pike wrote a letter to Mazzini, and that was dated August 15, 1871, in which he propagated that there should be a world order, a one order where all nations are under the control of one central organization. And in order to achieve this, they planned, and there are numerous quotes for this, so I've put a number on the screen because some will say, I don't trust this, I don't trust that, I don't trust the other. Here are references down there, there are references up there, there will be references in other slides, so it comes from different sources. He said, and this was, by the way, on display in the British Museum and could be seen there until it was taken away. The First World War, to overthrow the power of the Tsars in Russia, protector of orthodoxy, and bring about an atheistic communistic state. Did that happen? Yes. Now that was written long before this event. Long before this event. This was written in 1871. This war broke out in 1914. The Second World War, that's also written long before the event. To originate between Great Britain and Germany, to strengthen communism as antithesis to the Judeo-Christian culture, and bring about a Zionist state in Israel. Did it achieve this objective? Yes. In fact, after this war, Israel, in its present form, was reinstated under the protection of Britain. And then, interestingly enough, a Third World War, a Middle Eastern war involving Judaism and Islam and spreading internationally. That's fascinating. Is that on the cards, or what do you think?
Here, the police officers, FBI agents, towers, a huge explosion now, waiting to bring out all of us.
Certainly sounds like we are on track. Well, here's another quote, just in case people don't like that quote. Mazzini with Pike developed a plan for 3 world wars so that eventually every nation would be willing to surrender its national sovereignty to a world government. The first war was to end the Tsarist regime in Russia, the second to allow the Soviet Union to control Europe, the Third World War was to be in the Middle East between Muslim and Jews and would result in Armageddon. Interesting. Now, how were they going to do it? Let's read what Albert Pike wrote about these wars and how they were going to be unleashed. He wrote, quote, "We shall unleash the nihilist and the atheist," so the destroyer and the atheist, "and we will provoke a formidable social cataclysm which in its horror will show clearly to the nations the effect of absolute atheism. Origin of savagery and the most bloody turmoil. Then everywhere the citizens obliged to defend themselves against the minority of revolutionaries will exterminate these destroyers of civilization, and the multitude, disillusioned with Christianity, will receive the pure light through the universal manifestation of the pure doctrine of Lucifer. The destruction of Christianity and atheism, both conquered and exterminated at the same time." Wow, what a clever plan. So you rub the two systems which you create up against the other. You create atheism as an antithesis to the Judeo-Christian culture. You have these two clash until they rub each other up, and then out of that you will get a new world order where you have a new religion which is far more esoteric and actually honors Satan. Isn't that a rather clever plan? Well, it's very successful. That is why Ordo ab Cao is the verse, if you like, that Freemasonry uses. This is one of their documents, remember, that I photographed in a Masonic lodge.
Over the last, we'll say, 2 years, but has been accelerating over the last several months to the extent that what Obama is planning on doing. I mean, Obama can see the writing on the wall. There's dissatisfaction. There's unemployment. There's people that are going hungry in this country. There's civil discord. All of this is taking place. He can see the writing on the wall. It doesn't look good for his election. But these people have no plans on leaving, Alex. And I'm telling you right now, the people who rioted in the 1960s, the Bill Ayers and the Bernardine Dorns, who were actually the protesters in the 60s and early 70s, the Weather Underground, these are the people who Obama has by his side right now. These are the people who are my sources saying, look, what these people are doing, for example, Trayvon Martin, they're using this as a catalyst for racial unrest.
The NBC edited the tape to make it sound racist, and the Justice Department got caught with moles fomenting the new Black Panthers in people. I mean, they really are trying to get a race war.
Exactly, they are, and they're working toward that goal, but they're also looking toward the economic factors, and this is something that's so important that people really need to understand. What's going on in Europe right now, today, is coming to America. We're facing this massive hyperinflation, or this massive economic collapse in this country. I mean, your guest Gerald Celente, right on the money with his information. This is coming to America, and I'll tell you what, DHS knows this. They know that they can't stop this. They know that the dollar is going to collapse. They know that because of this, there's going to be class warfare, and that's the other leg of the table. And so when you have the racial component combined with the economic component, the class warfare, I'm going to tell you, they're expecting riots. They're expecting, not only expecting it, but they're seeding they're actually seeding it. For example, they've got, my source is telling me, according to the information that he's found, for example, Louis Farrakhan and others, now he would not name others, but others are on the payroll of the CIA. This is what my source is saying, allegedly, okay? Allegedly, Farrakhan is on the payroll of the CIA. Why? For what purpose? Well, to enhance and to facilitate the discord, the racial discord in this country. That's what's taking place. But they know they can't stop the collapse of the dollar. Obama, Bernanke working together to tank the dollar, the U.S. dollar, on purpose. I mean, they are destroying this country, and they're not going to leave until they're done. Well, when I say destroying the country, they're fundamentally changing the country. Well, when I say destroying the country, they're fundamentally changing the country, of course, in the words of Obama, changing it to a Marxist society.
Which is destroying the country.
Exactly.
Here are your coffins, which you paid for, with your tax money. There are millions of them waiting for you in different states across the country. Each coffin can hold 3 or 4 people, and most of you will be crammed into one right after martial law is declared in America. Your President George Bush is an important member of the Illuminati. The master plan of this satanic group of puppets is a new world order. Their goal is to kill 90% of the world's population so they can better control the rest of us, and they will start in America. They have already built many industrial ovens inside the FEMA death camps. These ovens will be used to get rid of the dead bodies. However, even burning these ovens day and night, they will not be faster than the gas killing hundreds to thousands of people at a time. So the plastic coffins will be used to store the rotting bodies.
The riots that are coming this summer, that are expected this summer, that are going to be enhanced by the actions of the government this summer, and you've pointed a lot of this stuff out. People need to listen to you very carefully because you give a lot of facts out. But it's amazing. Now they're going to pale in comparison to what's coming this summer if the timetable is correct.
And by the way, we've always heard this in bad economic times, but the murders and the racial attacks and the craziness and people on edge, I'm seeing it everywhere. And I live in the wealthiest per capita city rated by Forbes, Austin, and it's already bad here. I can't imagine Southern California, Michigan, places like that, Florida. I mean, it's going to be a powder keg.
Indeed it is. And that's what they're counting on. And you know, again, this whole thing is coming. It's going to come like a tsunami. It's going to hit us like a ton of bricks. There's a lot of people. You've woken up a lot of people, Alex, and thank you for that. But there are a lot of people who just have no clue, no idea. And one thing my source did tell me that I was very concerned about is the fact that, of course, we all know about the FEMA camps that don't exist. Of course they do. They're disaster relief centers, according to, their names. People, when they get hungry and they're unprepared, they're going to flock to these camps.
And this guy, Albert Pike, who was a Freemasonic god in America in the 1800s, Sovereign Grand Commander, Mother Supreme Council of the World, and all this stuff. They love their titles, these people. Pathetic. And he wrote this. This was in a book for Freemasons. Fictions are necessary to the people, and the truth becomes deadly to those who are not strong enough to contemplate it in all its brilliance. In fact, what can there be in common between the vile multitude and sublime wisdom? The truth must be kept secret, and the masses need a teaching proportional to their imperfect reason. That's what they do, is hoard the advanced knowledge and give us a fake version of reality. And Brzezinski talks about this area. He's been talking about this area for a long time. He calls it Eurasia. And he says that to control the world, in effect, in simple terms, you need to control Eurasia, this area of land that includes key places like Afghanistan, Iran, the places around the Caspian Sea, this great area of oil and gas reserves, like Georgia, where they've been having problems recently, Pakistan, and all this area, which so much of the world is now focusing on, is this area of the world going up into Russia. And Brzezinski seems to have a morbid genetic hatred of Russia for some reason, and that's what we're seeing. Because there are plans to use Israel and use the Jewish people in Israel to manifest a massive conflict which will lead to a third world war, which is what these guys are after. And Rahm Emanuel is the man who pulls the strings of Barack Obama, along with this guy, another Zionist, called David Axelrod. He was the guy that ran the whole of, masterminded the whole of the election campaign, both against Hillary Clinton and against John McCain. And it's Axelrod that is responsible for the words that appear on the teleprompter screens that Barack Obama reads. People are starting to call him the teleprompter president. It's so bloody obvious. That's why he never looks ahead. It's right, left, because that's where the screens are. Hello, Barack, over here. Sorry, I'm reading. And this is why you're getting the policy of Obama saying Palestinian refugees belong to their own state and do not have a literal right to return to Israel. He's talking about the people who fled, 800,000 of them, at the time of the bombing Israel into existence in 1948, and have never allowed to come back to their own land. People forget about this. White phosphorus, pepper bombing, the most crowded piece of land on the planet, the Gaza Strip. We don't target civilians, we just bomb where they live. Unbelievable. We're just protecting ourselves. No, it's a slaughter. And now I'm hearing, oh, there's a lot of anti-Israeli sentiment. Do you know something? I have a way around that. Stop slaughtering innocent people from the sky, okay? End of story. And it will go away. And this is important. This is important for what's planned to come. We now have a situation in Israel where the extreme of the extreme has taken the reins of power. Benjamin Netanyahu, he's talked about, these are his words summarized, he wants a violent reoccupation of Gaza to liquidate its elected government. And he pledges to thwart the Iranian threat once and for all. He's now got this guy, Lieberman, as his foreign minister, and this man's so far right, he topples over, right? And he's got Barak as the defense minister in this new government, and he was defense minister that oversaw the pepper bombing of the Gaza Strip. And this is Martin van Creveld. He's a well-known historian in Israel, and this is what he said publicly. We possess several hundred atomic warheads and rockets and can launch them at targets in all directions, perhaps even at Rome. Most European capitals are targets for our Air Force. We have the capability to take the world down with us, and I can assure you that that will happen before Israel goes under. They have a policy of not saying if they've got nuclear weapons or they haven't. They just don't talk about it. And a guy called Mordecai Vanunu, a wonderful Israeli man, went to jail for, I think it was 18 years, for exposing the fact publicly that they did have nuclear weapons. And now we've got this thing, oh, Iran's going to have nuclear weapons. What? The idea, and we're seeing it almost complete now, from the start, was to drive out the Palestinian people, not be at one with them, not share power with them, not share the land with them. The green bits are Palestinian land over the period of time up to the year 2000, and it's gone on since then, as illegal settlements are put in Palestinian land. And one of the people that lives in an illegal settlement is Lieberman. As an Australian newspaper said this week, he must be the only foreign minister in the world who doesn't actually live within the borders of his own country. And the Middle East policy in Obama's administration is by Bilderberg, George Mitchell, Bilderberg, Council on Foreign Relations, by the notorious Little Kissinger, Richard Holbrooke, who played a major part in breaking up the former Yugoslavia in wars, etc., so it could be absorbed into NATO and the European Union, which it is being now. He's Bilderberg Group, Council on Foreign Relations, Trilateral Commission. He's now in charge of Pakistan-Afghanistan policy. And this man, who is an arch-Zionist called Dennis Ross, he's now in charge of Iran policy. What it's building to is an effort, and Brzezinski is behind this among many others, to create a conflict out of the Middle East and in this area we're looking at, to bring about a third world war. And the third world war will be, and this was been written about in the past, that there were going to be 3 world wars to bring this new world order into being, a war that would finish off the superpowers and bring the whole world under the control of a world government, which will then dictate to every country.
We have a responsibility to act.
Bomb, 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 why bomb Iran? Why bomb, bomb, why bomb Iran? Bomb, 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 why bomb Iran? Bomb, 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 why bomb Iran? Bomb, 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 why bomb Iran. They got rockets and Russia, China, and the tanks bomb Iran. Why bomb Iran? 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 They got rockets and Russia, China, and the tanks bomb Iran. Why bomb Iran? IAEA says no nukes there, but we're good to go. Bomb Iran. Why bomb Iran? Why bomb Iran? They got rockets and Russia, China, and the tanks bomb Iran. Why bomb Iran? Why bomb Iran? Why bomb Iran? Why bomb Iran? They got rockets and Russia, China, and the tanks bomb Iran. Why bomb Iran? Netanyahu says it's all for you. Bomb Iran. Bomb Iran. Bomb Iran. They got rockets and Russia, China, and the tanks bomb Iran. Why bomb Iran? World War III. Albert Pike says it's meant to be. Bomb Iran. Why bomb Iran? Why bomb Iran? They got rockets and Russia, China, and the tanks bomb Iran. Why bomb Iran? They got rockets and Russia, China, and the tanks bomb Iran. Why bomb Iran?
The time for our leadership is now. It was the United States and the United Kingdom and our democratic allies that shaped a world in which new nations could emerge and individuals could thrive. And even as more nations take on the responsibilities of global leadership, our alliance will remain indispensable to the goal of a century that is more peaceful, more prosperous, and more just. The nature of our leadership will need to change with the times. Shortly after 9/11, that our war is not against Islam. Bin Laden was not a Muslim leader. He was a mass murderer of Muslims. Indeed, Al-Qaeda has slaughtered scores of Muslims in many countries, including our own. So his demise should be welcomed by all who believe in peace and human dignity. I receive this honor with deep gratitude and great humility. It's an award that speaks to our highest aspirations, that for all the cruelty and hardship of our world, we are not mere prisoners of fate. And yet I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge the considerable controversy that your generous decision has generated. In part, this is because I am at the beginning and not the end of my labors on the world stage.
So all eyes are now on Pakistan, where Osama bin Laden was killed, and reporters are suggesting that the government was sheltering the terrorist leader for years. But how is this possible if the country is indeed one of the major victims of terrorism? I mean, do you think that's really believable?
Let me say, first of all, what I have to say about bin Laden is based on a 500-page, rather exhaustive book that I've written, 9/11 Synthetic, Made in USA. I think this is a completely manufactured, invented story, created out of whole cloth by the U.S. intelligence community, primarily for the purpose of targeting Pakistan, and there's been a build-up to it. We had a very harsh statement condemning Pakistan in one of the terror reports of the U.S. government. We had Admiral Mullen visiting Pakistan, accusing them of being accomplices of the terrorist Haqqani network. We then had the CIA limited hangout operation known as WikiLeaks targeting Pakistan. The Washington Post putting that on the front page. The center of gravity of Al-Qaeda was always Pakistan, and now we have this manufactured story. Abbottabad, allegedly the hiding place, the lair of bin Laden for the past 6 years. It's totally fantastic, but the purpose is clear enough. They're targeting Pakistan for more attacks. The Chinese government has understood this immediately. We have a very strong statement from China this morning, basically saying to the U.S., if you mess with Islamabad, you will be messing with Beijing, and this will get into something much bigger than you thought. The main danger right now is false flag terror events, in reality organized by the U.S. or by NATO intelligence, that will be blamed on Pakistan. And indeed, we have this from several CIA people in the media here saying there will be revenge terror attacks, but they'll be coming from the Inter-Services Intelligence Network. That is the much demonized ISI of Pakistan. And you can see this is a complete setup. So people need to be vigilant in that regard.
The U.S. says it has photos of slain bin Laden. ABC News is reporting right now that they may in fact release them today. But why don't you think they release them right away, get all the skepticism over with over the death of bin Laden?
I can't speculate about that, but I'm sure that whatever they release will essentially be a fraud. The real bin Laden has been dead for a long time. And for the last 6, 7, 8 years, you've been hearing primarily audio statements from a kind of production company located probably in Pakistan.
All right,
unemployed actors.
I'm sorry, Webb. I'm going to move on here now because this is one of the many conspiracy theories that we've been talking about yesterday and today. Yes, they're out there. You're talking about it. We had a guest talk about it yesterday. The Taliban is talking about it. I'm going to move on. Many agree that the U.S. foreign policy prompted the attack of, prompted the dawn of Al-Qaeda back in the 80s. That's no secret. Now it's supporting rebels in Libya who allegedly have links with extremism. How long do you think the U.S. may continue a pattern of arming extremists or possible extremists who later there's blowback from?
Well, this is the tremendous contradiction, is that the United States is openly supporting Al-Qaeda forces, which represent a large part of the Benghazi Rebel Council in Libya. In Libya or in Yemen, Al-Qaeda is it's one of the main tools of the U.S. in destabilizing the government. One suspects that in Syria and in Algeria that's also the case. But then, in sharp contradiction, if you're Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan or Pakistan, then you have to be bombed. And this is an unsustainable contradiction. It just makes absolutely no sense. I think what we're actually seeing is the decline of the U.S. empire. If you look back at the fall of the Spanish, the French, the British empires, in those cases, the fall of the empire has been accompanied by world wars. Now, if the United States decides to go after Pakistan, trying to split Pakistan into Sindh, Baluchistan, Punjab, Pashtunistan, you're going to get a collision between the United States and China. And at that point, Russia will also have to respond in some way. What you're seeing is how the decline of empire can lead to war by miscalculation. The U.S. ruling elite is in a frenzy because they are trying to stop Saudi Arabia and Pakistan from leaving the empire, from making a jailbreak, from bolting out from under U.S. hegemony. So that is why they've chosen to liquidate hundreds of billions of dollars they've invested in the mythological figure of bin Laden. They wouldn't be doing that if it weren't something big. It goes far beyond Obama's fortunes at the polls. It's an attempt to try to save the U.S. position in the world.
Involvement in the internal affairs of sovereign countries often consists in co-opting members of opposition parties, financing them through the National Endowment for Democracy, Freedom House, various private foundations, essentially with a view to implementing regime change. In other words, installing politicians who are chosen and who are there to replace an existing political system. And that is what we call a client regime. And there are many U.S. client regimes around the world. Okay, we don't even need to mention names. We have client regimes in the former Soviet Union. In Georgia is a good case of a client regime. And we see how the United States, through its foundations, manages also to influence the course of politics in Georgia, specifically for serving U.S. strategic objectives in that region. The support to members of opposition parties in Russia should come as no surprise. The Russian government is a government which states its points of view. If the United States doesn't like these points of view, or if they consider that Russia is not on the right wavelength, they will attempt to weaken or destabilize the government, the existing government, and contemplate the possibility of a regime change, as they have in numerous countries around the world. There are countries which have their own independent governments, which don't take orders from Washington, in Latin America, in the Middle East. And these countries, if they do not abide by US demands, the United States will attempt a regime change. And how do they undertake a regime change? They establish links with opposition political parties. They may be involved in covert operations through the intelligence apparatus. And of course, these opposition groups are often financed directly by US foundations. This is part of a modus operandi. It's really the ABC of US foreign policy. I think it's very important that this issue be discussed and debated. And it's certainly very important that it's now being debated in Russia, because from our standpoint, this kind of diplomacy by the United States is unacceptable. That the United States would finance either directly from the State Department or through various front organizations such as the National Endowment for Democracy should support local groups to serve US interests domestically. The National Endowment for Democracy is really an outgrowth of the CIA. And you can look at its profile. It has, in fact, one of the former directors of the National Endowment for Democracy said, "We are doing legally what the CIA used to do." Okay? And you look at their mandate, well, their mandate is to support US-style democratization throughout the world. Now, US-style democratization, we know what it is. We know what it is. It's the antithesis of democracy. How can a country which is involved in targeted assassinations, torture, the whole process of financing and manipulating elections present itself as a role model?
The European Union is concerned about the situation in Russia because of certain restrictions on democratic liberties, such as free press. Do you understand the EU's concerns?
Понимаю, это давняя традиция европейских стран. Навязывать свои стандарты и правила.
I understand them. That's a long-standing tradition of European countries. They impose their standards and rules on others. Remember what happened during the colonization period, say in Africa. I get the impression that this old tradition has transformed into democratization. Europeans and our Western partners in general like to use this method whenever they want to get a tighter grip on a certain region. As for violations, they happen everywhere. Let's take, for example, human rights violations in the French penitentiary system, in French prisons. Yes, there are violations, and we should fight against them. In fact, I think even in the Russian political system, there are certain things that need to be adjusted or corrected or enhanced. But that's a natural process by which our society becomes mature. Look at our past. Initially we had the Tsar, then Stalin, and then the communist regime. It wasn't until the early 1990s that we started building a society based on different principles. It takes time.
Do you think the democratic model, the Western model, is not very good for Russia at this point?
Can you explain to me what you mean by the Western democratic model? There's one model in France and a different model in the US. At some point in the past, I had a lot of discussions with my American colleagues. I would ask them, how come the majority of your people voted for one person, yet another person becomes president? That's because they have the Electoral College. My American colleagues replied to me, don't touch this thing. We've got used to this system and we won't change it. So we don't lecture them. Well, what makes you think you can lecture us? We can decide for ourselves what we should do.
Now, the US and its Arab allies are quietly pursuing a missile defense system across the Persian Gulf. American officials say the project is aimed at repelling a possible attack from Iran. Washington has boosted sales of detection systems and missile batteries to countries like Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia. This map right here shows how the Iranian state is being increasingly encircled by all kinds of US military bases and weapons. Soraya Sepapur-Ulrich, an independent researcher and writer, believes a hypothetical threat from Tehran is a pretext for further expansion in a key strategic area.
America believes in realigning its forces to better control and dominate the world. And I think that perhaps, and it needs the cooperation of the countries involved. And I think that Iran being made into a threat has allowed the Arab countries to cooperate with America because really they rely on America for their internal securities, and which actually is an important point here because the internal securities of some of these countries are now in jeopardy. And with every base that America creates, with every missile defense shield or Patriot missile, everything that it exports to any given country, it has personnel going with it. So one has to question whether these are to calm down the potential threats that might arise in countries that have always supplied America with the oil it needed and the soldiers, or whether it's actually for a wider purpose.
Washington did join hands with those seeking to replace Gaddafi and take over power in Libya. To help prop them up, the U.S. pledged to funnel billions of dollars of Gaddafi's frozen assets to the Transitional Council.
I am currently drafting legislation at the request of the State Department and the administration that will authorize the transfer of available cash assets to the Council.
But the support from Washington comes not only in money and Tomahawk missiles, but also in military command. One of the commanders of the Libyan rebel army is General Khalifa Haftar, a longtime Gaddafi defector. He lived in a Washington suburb for the last 20 years, before he took off to Libya in March this year to command the rebel forces. Khalifa Haftar lived just minutes away from CIA headquarters, although any intelligence connections have never been officially confirmed.
At the moment we have CIA operatives all over eastern Cyrenaica, CIA agents who were there even before Obama recognized it and who have been pouring into eastern Libya, working alongside French intelligence and British SAS as well. They are manipulating the agenda of this transitional council.
Some analysts say the U.S. is using the turmoil in Libya to propel to power people who would be loyal to their interests.
Gaddafi, having been there for 40 years plus, had a will of his own. So he had a significant degree of independence and he had his own policies. You look at this collection of Jibril, Jalil, Yunus, and Haftar. These people are foreign agents. They're NATO stooges. They're completely controlled, and they will never be able to assert any kind of independent, autonomous Libya. The risks of the puppet regime are that this will degenerate into chaos. Right now, the rebels can only exist with complete NATO support.
A number of leaders who were propped up by Washington have faced popular discontent. In Egypt, Hosni Mubarak had been extensively supported by the U.S. for decades, despite domestic disapproval of his policies. Yemen has seen violent protests over the rule of its president, who many believe has managed to hold on to power only thanks to U.S. support. And the government of Hamid Karzai in Afghanistan has been struggling with public discontent for years.
The U.S. and its allies will go in to establish some sort of a regime that we approve of, but the process is not going to be a democratic one, and in the long run, the odds are overwhelming that the Libyan people will reject that regime. The American policymakers who talk about this kind of thing are not themselves deluded. They know perfectly well what they're doing. They know it's not going to work in the long run, but they have other reasons for wanting to have short-term gains.
Having clearly taken sides in the Libyan civil war, Washington is now seeking to forge strong ties with whoever might come to power there. But analysts say such an overwhelming support, financial, military, and political, never comes without strings attached. I'm Ganesh Chekyan reporting from Washington, RT.
The head of Britain's armed forces insists that killing Colonel Gaddafi will be within the rules as NATO appears to ready itself for a long war. But investigative journalist Tony Gosselin says it's the alliance that should be brought to justice, not the Libyan leader.
This is a political decision. It should never be a military decision. I think the reason that the military chief has announced it is really to save the face of our politicians here in Britain, who are pushing this whole matter way beyond what was agreed at the United Nations Security Council. That is a serious problem, and this is why the Russians and others are now saying there must be a ceasefire. Why is it, we have to ask ourselves, that the British and NATO particularly, this is a NATO initiative now, have decided that they want to intervene so heavily in this civil war, rather than let the Libyan people decide for themselves the outcome of how they want the politics in their country to be in the future. This is, I would consider, a war crime under the present situation, and it goes way outside the present UN resolution. We don't see Colonel Gaddafi going into foreign countries, invading them, bombing them, attacking them. We don't see these long protracted wars carried out by Colonel Gaddafi. I think he's the least of our problems, and we should see Tony Blair and George Bush in the dock at the International Criminal Court.
Who gave coalition forces in Libya the right to eliminate Gaddafi? Well, that's the question Vladimir Putin's been asking during an official visit to Denmark. The Russian premier also said NATO's effectively joined one of the warring sides in the conflict, and more responsible action should be taken instead. RT's Daniel Bushell joins us now live for this in Brussels. Daniel, so the Russian prime minister has effectively lashed out on the operation there in Libya.
Yes, he's made the speech in Denmark, and he was very angry. He says that Gaddafi is not the best person in the world. Sure, he's made many mistakes, done many bad things, but that does not give the coalition the right to bomb indiscriminately. His words were that they are bombing Gaddafi's palaces in Tripoli every night. Now, coalition said that their plan was not to get rid of Gaddafi. So his question was, Mr. Putin's question was, why are the coalition forces obviously making this effort to go after Colonel Gaddafi himself? Now, we also heard that the experts here in Brussels have confirmed that there is bombing going on by the coalition forces, which is not being covered by the media here in the European Union. Mr. Putin added that oil was a key interest for the Western powers, for the European powers who have gone into Libya, that they want to get rid of Gaddafi and install people who are more favourable to the European Union so that European companies can control the oil reserves. Let's have a listen to exactly what Mr. Putin had to say.
The coalition said destroying Gaddafi was not their goal. Then why bomb his palaces? Now some officials have claimed that eliminating him was in fact their goal. Who gave them that right? Did he have a fair trial? Returning to the no-fly zone, the bombings are destroying the country's entire infrastructure. When the so-called civilized world uses all its military power against a small country, destroying what's been created by generations, I don't know if that's good.
Mr. Putin said that they have to give the Libyan people time to sort out their own problems, and there's really double standards here, he added. There are several other parts of the region in the Middle East and North Africa which is facing pretty much civil war situations, but which the West is either ignoring or not really paying the same amount of attention to.
Now, Washington has strongly backed the Libyan opposition since revolutionary wave engulfed the state. It's now equally enthusiastic in its support against Syria's President Bashar al-Assad. But the concern is whether America's decision to take sides could backfire on its closest Middle East ally, Israel. RT's Gane Jijikian looks at the possible repercussions of US policy.
As nations in the Middle East and North Africa are torn between the struggle to bring about change and the struggle not to let that change ruin their lives, Washington views the Arab Spring as an opportunity to finally see some of its longtime foes crumble.
Even though Iran is not an Arab country, the Arab Spring could spread to...
Absolutely. And I think in many ways it's a matter of time before that kind of change and reform and revolution occurs in Iran.
Under the umbrella of Arab revolutions, Washington is also beating the drums of regime change in Syria, Iran's closest ally in the region. Violence within the country has been widely condemned. Countries like Russia and China call for both sides in Syria to talk and end the bloodshed, while America is blaming Assad alone.
The transition to democracy in Syria has begun, and it's time for Assad to get out of the way.
I think Assad's days, just like Gaddafi, are numbered.
Let's hope that Bashar Assad is next in line.
They've overthrown Gaddafi. They're going to have a proxy or client government in Tripoli. The next step is Syria. They want to overthrow Syria next, to take advantage of any movement that exists in Syria to overthrow the Assad government. Not to have a more democratic government, a more humane government, but a government that is allied with the United States. And after Syria, the next target will be Iran itself.
Watching regimes go down one by one, American politicians are filled with new hopes and aspirations. Some went as far as to predict the Arab Spring would spread all across the world.
What this is all about is the Arab Spring, and Bashar Assad is next. And even places like China and Russia and other places, they are very uneasy. This is about people aspiring for freedom, and that's what the Libyan people have just achieved.
That's wishful thinking on the part of John McCain, but it speaks volumes to where the real orientation is in Washington, not just of the Republicans, but the Democrats too. So they would like to overthrow the government in China. They would like to overthrow the government in Russia. They would like to overthrow the government in Venezuela and Cuba, or wherever people are independent of the dictates of Washington.
But when it comes to Syria and Iran, Washington doesn't seem to be just fantasizing about revolutions. It actively fosters the process by pledging support for anti-government movements there. But some say this might eventually turn against America's closest ally in the region, Israel.
What you have with Hamas could essentially spread to many more places, and then you'd have a much, much larger population base in an extremely hostile position towards the very existence of Israel.
By throwing its support behind revolution makers, analysts say Washington is seeking to increase its influence and control in these countries.
Let's look at how things have been in the control department so far. Egypt. Thousands protest against the U.S.-backed military there that's still in power. Last week, Egyptians stormed the Israeli embassy, enraged by the killing of 5 Egyptian border guards. In Libya, a Washington-supported leadership is taking over, but the country is at risk of plunging into tribal war. Syria, the opposition includes those with radical agendas. So the aftermath of the so-called Arab Spring remains very murky and difficult. Yet Washington seems to be using the Arab Spring to fulfill its long-time goals.
30 Dutch troops and 20 German colleagues are the first in a large NATO deployment also involving US forces. The mission comes after Turkey asked for help protecting its southeastern cities from a possible Syrian conventional or chemical missile attack.
Iran could attack the United States in a much more fearsome way. New York could eventually be on Iran's hit list.
U.S. media reports
desperate new pleas come out of the country. The oppressors and the oppressed, stop the killing.
Echoing Washington's repeated warnings.
They could well carry out the attack.
American officials have labeled Syria and Iran as grave threats to global security. However, former U.S. Attorney General Ramsey Clark says the biggest threat to world peace is his own country's military and foreign policy. In an exclusive interview with RT, the lawyer and activist says America's next catastrophic mistake will likely be a war with Iran.
My impression is that Israel is pressing for an assault before the election, and that the Obama administration is resisting that without favoring Iran in any way, but simply as a domestic political matter.
Well, the U.S. can't really afford to get involved in another war, can it?
Well, I hope not. But that's not the way it works. I mean, you do crazy things, and that's why the world's such a mess. If Israel strikes, and there's retaliation, that the United States will intervene. And I don't think it's Obama's choice, but I think he thinks that if he doesn't act with Israel, that it'll be too costly in the election, and he'll do it. You have to see the American system to know this, or to really understand it fully. If he loses this election, he's a failed president. All of his major decisions will be primarily affected by how they impact on the coming election. Because if he loses that election, anything he accomplished, and he accomplished a few things, health care and things like that, are better than they were. They're far from ideal, and far from what, if he has the Congress in the second session, he could do. But he struggled against enormous pressures. The Pentagon's ability, I mean, I've watched presidents President Johnson was one of them. Those guys come in from the Pentagon, he just thinks, my God, they know everything, I don't know nothing.
With respect to Syria, while speaking to the United Nations Security Council, the Syrian ambassador reportedly quoted a statement that you said nearly 22 years ago. He said, quote, "The UN, which was established to prevent the encouragement of war, has become itself a tool for war." How do you perceive the circumstances surrounding Syria right now, and the U.S. and European actions and campaign for some type of intervention?
Well, Syria is under extreme international and to some degree domestic pressure and violence for only one reason. And it's the same reason that gave us Iraq and Afghanistan and Libya. Syria is a part of the effort to eliminate every independent Arab government, independent of U.S. control.
You think that's the goal? It's not humanitarian reasons?
Oh my God, no. I mean, it's geopolitical.
Russia accused Libya of training the Syrian militia currently fighting government forces. It was part of a broader discussion of the situation in the Arab countries, with Moscow also demanding NATO apologize for causing civilian casualties during last year's air raids in Libya. RT's Marina Portnaya has been following the meeting in New York.
A new report that was quietly released by the United Nations on Friday. That report was an investigation that found in part that NATO has not sufficiently investigated the air raids it conducted on Libya in 2011 that killed at least 60 civilians and injured at least 55 more people. Despite the findings of this 220-page report, NATO officials have refused so far to further investigate the fatalities or the casualties that this report was referring to. Now, the Russian ambassador to the United Nations, Vitaly Churkin, also went on to say that order has not yet been established nearly or more than a year after NATO carried out its airstrikes to allegedly bring a more peaceful and secure circumstance to Libya. The situation is still very dangerous.
We have expressed concern about the uncontrolled proliferation of Libyan arms in the region. However, it is not just the weapons that are going abroad. We have received information that in Libya, with the support from the authorities, there is a special training center for the Syrian revolutionaries, and that people are sent to Syria to attack the legal government. This is completely unacceptable according to all legal bases. This activity undermines the stability in the Middle East. We We think that Al-Qaeda is in Syria, and therefore there is an issue. Is transporting the revolution now turning into transporting of terrorism?
In the aftermath of what happened in Libya 1 year later, the situation on the ground, many critics say, is not safer by any means.
In Syria, we're now seeing a situation where the Arab League is calling for a halt to violence and the beginning of dialogue, and Western countries and the capitals of some countries of the region are making calls to the contrary, expressly recommending the opposition hold no talks with the Assad regime. It looks like a political provocation on an international scale. Yes, violence has to be stopped, but this demand has to be addressed to the authorities and the armed groups in the Syrian opposition.
So what's your take on this? Do you agree that the calls coming from the West are not helping to stabilize the situation in the region?
Surely not. Certainly, Mr. Lavrov is on very firm ground there. I've just completed about a 1 week fact-finding tour of the country. I've been in Homs, I've been in Tartus, Banyas, I've been in the military hospital here in Baghdad, and I can tell you what average, everyday Syrians of all ethnic groups, Christian, Alawite, Sunni, Shiite, Druze, what they say about this is that they are being shot at by snipers. In Homs in particular, people complained that there are terrorist snipers who are shooting at civilians, men, women, and children, blind terrorism, random killing, simply for the purpose of destabilizing the country. I think I would not call this a civil war by any stretch of the imagination. I think that's a very, very misleading term in the following sense. What you're dealing with here are death squads. You're dealing here with terror commandos, the kind of thing that everybody remembers from Argentina and the Central America. This is a typical CIA method. In this case, it's a joint production of CIA, MI6, Mossad, the DGSE of the French. It's got money coming from Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Qatar, and it has a couple of interesting managers. The manager I think you should point to perhaps most is a guy called Khaddam. Khaddam was the foreign minister in this country for quite a couple of decades. He's almost 80 years old. He operates from Paris. And I think he's being groomed by NATO as the new dictator of some kind of a future.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. If I could just jump in for a moment. It's very interesting how you bring in the issue of that there are unknown snipers, there are terror commandos, death squads with links to the West and the West's allies in Saudi Arabia, for example. But Assad's rule is increasingly being called illegitimate. But isn't the US and that of Europe concerned that getting rid of the Syrian president could just cause even more violence? For example, what we're seeing right now in Tahrir Square in Egypt.
Well, after Libya becoming a bloodbath with 150,000 dead, and now with Egypt showing what it was all along, there was no revolution there. It was a complete failure, and now people are beginning to understand it. Notice that nevertheless, Mrs. Clinton and Ms. Rice at the United Nations are continuing to push this bankrupt, discredited model of the color revolution, the CIA people power coup, backed up by terrorist troops, people from Al-Qaeda, people from the Muslim Brotherhood, people from Salafist organizations, and so forth. And I've heard this now from some very important religious authorities here. There's a growing movement inside the Islamic community here which says we want reconciliation, we want law and order, we want legality, we don't want fanatics to run the show. The fanatics are being brought in by the Western powers.
So the fanatics are coming in by the Western powers. You're seeing a fair amount of unification among the Muslims there. But let's draw some comparisons, if we may. UN Resolution 1973 for Libya to protect civilians there. Do you think is the grand plan here for Syria that of the Western states to get in there for regime in Syria? And if that is their plan, then what is the point? What is there to gain?
Very, very important thing is that this is the most tolerant society in the Middle East. This is one place where all kinds of people live together in, I think, remarkable harmony. And again, it's a very wide variety. Muslims of all kinds, Christians of all kinds, right? Christian, Greek Orthodox, Greek Catholics, Melkites, Syriacs, many, many other kinds, Druzes, Kurds, and so forth. This is a model of the peaceful coexistence of various ethnic groups. Now, the U.S. policy, I think right now, is to smash the Middle East according to ethnic lines. In other words, if you can have a divide and conquer policy which says the Christians will be kicked out of Lebanon and the Christians will be, say, kicked out of Syria in the way that they have been kicked out of Iraq, and ironically a lot of them went to Syria, you can get a situation where all of these countries are fatally weakened. The way in which it's introduced is, if you look at Syria, the main centers of trouble are on the Turkish border, the Syrian border with Jordan, with Iraqi Kurdistan, and then with Lebanon. And I think Lebanon, thanks to Saad Hariri, may be the main one.
We are running very long time here. I'm so sorry, we are running a long time. But if I may, with Western powers calling for restraint on both sides in Egypt, why do they only take a one-sided approach when it comes to what's going on in Syria?
Well, it's all the tactics of demagogy and the modulation of demagogy from one minute to the next. But what we have here in Syria is a cynical media campaign, because I've been in Homs. When you go to Homs and you go to the Zahra neighborhood, which is supposed to be the hottest point in the whole country, you find people who are pro-Assad. They're concerned, number one, about mazout. They want to have heating oil because the winter is coming and it's getting cold. And you ask them, what is your demand? They say, we want the Syrian army to come in here. We want the Syrian army posted on the roofs of the houses with helicopters and tanks. Stop these snipers from killing us. Don't let these black hooded figures, which is what they are, pretending to be deserters when they're really maybe from Chechnya, they're from Libya, they're from Afghanistan or Pakistan. Foreign fighters have been brought in here by the CIA and the other Western services, and that is what's going on. And that is, I think, a very, very large part of it. And in the city of Homs, for example, in one hospital, they were telling us it was 5 dead and 7 wounded on one day. And what was it? It's all snipers. It's all these terrorists who are shooting the civilian population. Of course, when Al Jazeera arrives, they say, oh, those deaths are the responsibility of the Syrian army. That is absolute baloney. This is a Goebbels big lie campaign. There is no civil war here. There is no insurrection. There is no mass political movement against us. These are very, very limited, minor, strictly localized phenomena. This looks nothing like Libya. I know what a civil war in a modern Arab country looks like. I've been in Libya during the summer. There's no civil war. I think we have to go back a little bit. Remember, the difference of Obama compared to Bush Cheney is that Bush Cheney were the advocates of direct U.S. military action. U.S. would bomb and invade countries like Afghanistan, Iraq, others. With Obama, it's much more nuanced. It's based on deception, dissembling, and treachery. And the strategy is called buck passing. Buck passing means if you have an ally like Turkey, which is showing very disturbing signs of independent action, and then you have a country like Syria, which is aligned with Russia and China, the way to deal with that is not to have a direct U.S. military attack, but to play one against the other. In particular, I'm thinking of 2010. Turkey was showing signs, I think, of world leadership in some ways. Turkey combined with Brazil to try to cool down the question of the Iranian nuclear program and back the world away from a general war over that. That's very positive. But that alarmed people here in Washington. So the result of that was Obama got on the phone with Erdogan, and he promised that he would make Erdogan great, that Turkey would become a regional hegemon. And by the way, they were going to go after Syria, and the Syrian government would fall. The Syrian government would go down like Tunisia with just a couple of days. And Erdogan and Davutoglu bought into that, and they've now gone way out on a limb. I understand about 18% of the Turkish population is interested in military action against Syria. So there's a tremendous majority against military action, but since Erdogan and Davutoglu control the main party, they can get this vote, which now takes us a step further towards some larger armed confrontation. It's beginning to look more and more like the Spanish Civil War. And remember, if Hillary Clinton gets on the telephone with Davutoglu, she's not telling him to cool it. She's saying, assert your rights, get out in front even more. So because of their vanity and ambition and related factors, Erdogan and Davutoglu have gone very far down the road. And you wonder, is there a way back for them? I would urge them to find a way back, to pull back from this. This is not in Turkey's interest. And if we get a conflict between Turkey and Syria, the one who's laughing will be the United States, because they will have disposed of two countries that were resisting the imperial dictates coming from here.
Well, what do you suggest in terms of Turkey finding a way back there, Whipster Griffin Tarpley? Don't you think? Do you think that that's a possibility at any point? Maybe they might be mulling that, as you said, in terms of the breakdown. Go ahead.
The entire rebellion in Syria is artificial. It's fomented from the outside. These are death squads that NATO has brought in. They've shipped them in from Libya by means of an airlift. They've gathered them from half the world. If Turkey would simply say, we're going to close our border, we're not going to allow these killers to use bases inside Turkey, this would come to a rather quick end. And of course, Lebanon, Syria, and the Kurdish entity would also have to go along. But mainly it's Turkey right now concerning Aleppo.
Okay, Mr. Morikawa, we'll get to you for a response that I see you have, but let me just bring in Sal Landau here, and I'd like to expand, Sal Landau, on what Whipster Griffin Tarpley said, disturbing signs by Turkey of independent action. It certainly looks like that. I mean, Ibrahim Kalin, the foreign policy advisor to Prime Minister Erdogan, he said Turkey retaliated without declaring war, but doesn't the resolution reached in the parliament lay the groundwork for war when Turkey deems it necessary? Parliament, a quick reminder here, authorized the government to send Turkish forces to foreign countries with the administration determining the where, the scope, the numbers, and the time of such deployment.
I think it is a dangerous situation, and I don't think it should be underplayed. I mean, I have the feeling that the Archduke might be visiting Sarajevo any day now. I mean, laying the conditions for a much larger conflict as the one that started World War I. I mean, the fact is that Syria, which has bent over backwards to please the United States over the last 10 years, they tortured people that were sent there for rendition. They tipped the United States off about possible attacks against U.S. bases and property there in the region. And I remember when I was in Syria and a government official said, why is it that Washington doesn't respond to our deeds? And I said, no good deed goes unpunished. Syria is, after all, essentially allied with Iran. And that is what is really in disfavor. And I think it's true that the West, along with Saudi Arabia, is arming and training the foreign troops that are going into Syria and fomenting much of the violence that is occurring there on an unprecedented scale. It is very dangerous, and I think you have Russia on one side and China also, which is opposing Western action, and then you have the NATO powers using essentially Turkey. When Turkey's, I don't understand President Erdogan's ambition in this particular case. The Syrians have told him very clearly they don't want to go to war with Turkey. It's been a peaceful situation. I also don't understand why Israel is supporting this move against President Assad, because Assad has maintained stability on the Golan Heights. And if a new regime replaces this in Turkey, it may very well be led by very fundamentalist jihadists who will not respect that Golan Heights border. So it's a very dangerous situation, and I think the West should back off. And President Obama should be advised to do so immediately.
The U.S. Defense Secretary has confirmed that Washington sent troops to the Jordan-Syria border in what's seen as America's growing involvement in the conflict now. Liam Panetta says the task team is there to enhance Jordan's capabilities in case violence spills over from Syria. Artis Ganici-Chikad's got the latest from Washington.
According to Defense Secretary Leon Panetta, they sent the troops to Jordan-Syrian border in case violence escalates in Syria and spills over the border. Leon Panetta did not go into details as to how many troops and so on, but another U.S. defense official, speaking on condition of anonymity, said the forces are made up of 100 military personnel and other personnel who stayed on in Jordan after attending an annual exercise in May. And several dozen more have flown in since. They are operating from the joint U.S.-Jordanian military center north of Amman that Americans have used for years. The news about U.S. military personnel so close to Syria, that is boots on the ground, of course suggests an escalation in the U.S. military involvement in the conflict, even as Washington pushes back on any suggestion of a direct intervention in Syria. But Jordan is not the only place where the U.S. has military presence. If we look at Syria and the U.S. military presence in the region, we see that Syria is pretty much surrounded militarily. Also, tension is growing on the border between Syria and Turkey after several days of shelling. This Wednesday, Turkey's military chief vowed to respond with more force. That is a day after NATO said it stood ready to defend Turkey. But this latest development with U.S. troops in Jordan comes with the U.S. presidential election less than a month away, at a time when Mitt Romney, Barack Obama's challenger, is criticizing the president for not being aggressive enough, for quote-unquote sitting on the sidelines, for missing the opportunity to topple Assad and, quote, deliver that defeat to Iran. Yes, he actually said that. So it's not clear whether this latest announcement about Jordan is the administration's way of showing teeth in this election campaign, or whether an intervention in Syria is really coming soon. One of the reasons why the rebels refuse to settle for a negotiated solution through dialogue is the signal that they get, that sense that support is on the way, that there will be an intervention. But everybody understands without a negotiated solution, the bloodshed will continue. So the signals that the rebels are getting, including the news about U.S. troops standing by across the border, could be making it that much harder to come to that negotiated solution.
Ghana Chichikan, well, independent journalist Niall Bowie thinks border protection is just a pretext to press harder for a change of the Syrian regime.
Throughout the duration of the conflict in Syria, we've heard a lot of talk about the creation of humanitarian corridors or buffer zones along the Turkish border, and now we're hearing reports of the same being established on the Jordanian border. So ostensibly that is what the American personnel in Jordan are there to do. But one needs to acknowledge the fact that this is not the policy of the Turkish government, nor is it the policy of the Jordanian government. The U.S. think tank, the Brookings Institute, in March 2012 published a report titled Assessing Regime Change Options in Syria, where they specifically cite the creation of a buffer zone or humanitarian corridor as a means to base certain rebel groups in the region to project force towards the Syrian government in an attempt to topple it. So that appears to be what is playing out at the moment.
The idea of giving heavy artillery to these so-called buffer zones is the most cynical thing imaginable. It's going to create civil war. It's going to create bloodshed, anything but peace, as your commentator pointed out just previous to our discussion here. So this is one of the most dangerous moves of the whole Syrian engagement by NATO in the last 18 months.
But surely by France giving the Syrian rebels heavy artillery and possibly anti-aircraft guns, hopefully, according to them, that will help to sow the seeds of a peaceful democracy.
Well, I think if you look at what the Muslim Brotherhood has been reported doing since they took the presidency in Egypt, you'll see that the Syrian opposition is dominated by the Muslim Brotherhood, the same organization, and their long-term agenda is introducing an Al-Qaeda or Taliban-like fanatical Islamic Sharia law into Syria and ending the tolerance of different religions, which has been the trademark of Syrian life for decades under the al-Assad family, but in general. And there are reports from journalists inside Syria over the last months of the so-called opposition. In many cases, they're Al-Qaeda or Mujahideen that have been brought in from Saudi Arabia and elsewhere, and and provided guns and weapons, that they have beheaded civilians and blamed the atrocities on the Assad government. So this is really, I don't know what you could call the equivalent of the Fabius recognition of a government in exile, or building a government in exile. Perhaps if the Russian government were to recognize the Ku Klux Klan as a government in exile in America and provided heavy artillery so that they could go against Washington.
I got an email from someone in Syria. I said I wouldn't read her name. I'm living in Syria. My city is Aleppo. We have lots of problems here. All these terrorists are coming from other countries and killing here the people. And almost all media out there not telling the truth. They're telling that our government are killing innocent people. This is not true. We are Christians living here, but we are now in danger. Syria isn't like Yemen or Libya. There are huge numbers of Christians here, but U.S. and some Europe governments don't caring about Christians here, just sending money and weapons to those people.
Demonstrating alliance solidarity, the Dutch, German and Turkish defence ministers have paid a visit to NATO Patriot batteries in Turkey. At an airbase in the southern city of Adana, the Dutch defence minister thanked her troops for their efforts. She said the Netherlands is proud to contribute to the protection of the Turkish people and their territory.
It's important for the Netherlands to be part of this mission because an ally and a country that we have close relationships with already for decades asked for assistance. So we acted accordingly to the Netherlands. The NATO solidarity does matter. And when we received the request, we said yes, and Parliament supported it. And the same goes for Germany and the United States.
The Syrian government maintains it's fighting terrorists, armed and controlled from abroad. Well, for more on what's happening in and around the war-torn country, I'm now joined live by political analyst Sukant Chandan. Sukant, NATO says that these missiles will act as a deterrent and they will de-escalate the conflict. So presumably a welcome move, this deployment of these missiles.
When has NATO ever been interested in the human rights of the people of the global south? Never. They've only been interested in domination and trauma, as we can see most profoundly and illustratively in relation to what they've done in Libya. So this is not in any way going to help the Turkish and especially the Syrian people. It's another step towards the final nail in the coffin, which the NATO hopes is the regime change against Syria. Now, we just had the conflict in Gaza, and I've been saying for a good part of 2 years that the resistance in Gaza has realized that it wants to have an open battle of war of liberation with the Zionist state and their Western backers to refocus this whole essentially pro-NATO in its policies Arab Spring, or should I call it the NATO Arab sting in the region. And with the resistance in Gaza that we saw just a few days ago, that's exactly what happened. Everything was starting to be exposed. Morsi was exposed as nothing better than Mubarak, and also it showed that the real enemy of the Arabs is the Zionist state and their backers, and that the Syria, Hezbollah and Iran were fundamental to the victory of the resistance in Gaza. And just like all the Arab armies were arrayed against Saddam back in the beginning of the 90s, similarly now Ba'athist Syria can turn the whole situation around if it does only what Saddam Hussein did at that time, which was to launch a war of liberation against the Zionist state itself. The Scuds flew at Tel Aviv back in the early 90s. We saw the Fajr 5s from Iran, Hezbollah and Syria flying at Jerusalem and Tel Aviv last week. And it's this, if Syria can focus on this struggle, the Arab masses, the Muslim masses and the masses of the global south will rally to its cause. Unfortunately, what we're seeing is a slow slide towards regime change in Syria, which is just an awful tragedy.
You talked about the launch of Scud missiles. Are you actually saying that these Patriot missiles will be used and actually be fired into Syria?
Well, they're deployed there. Well, what else is military hardware used, if not for either for military pressure?
Turkey's saying that they're using them. Obviously, they're saying they will need them to defend their citizens because some Turks have been killed already. Is Syria deliberately targeting Turkey?
No, of course Syria is not. Syria has no interest, and actually Turkey has no interest to ratchet up things against Syria either, because Turkey, after Syria, which I've said before, is the #1 loser in this whole situation in Syria, because they're negatively impacted by the refugees. Erdogan is becoming less and less popular inside Turkey because of his Syria policies. So this is not at all in the interest of Syria and Turkey. This is NATO taking Turkey along into this disastrous mess. But NATO are clever, or they're clever because our side is stupid. Because on the one hand, they're using Turkey against Syria, but also they're weakening Turkey in relation to Syria as well. Because the West are very clever. They know that although Turkey is an ally today, tomorrow it could be a regional power against the West, which it was before this whole Syria debacle, when Turkey had excellent relations with Syria, Iraq, Iran.
Sorry, you say the West is very clever, but has it really worked out what it'll do once Assad goes?
As Samar Amin, who's one of the best analysts of anti-imperialism in the global south from Egypt, has said, the West is only interested in destroying all Arab societies in order to create trauma, deep trauma within those societies, so it can facilitate the war and regime change operation against Iran successfully. This and only this is what the West is interested in right now in the Middle East, North African region.
Just a quick word about the threat of chemical weapons. That's been cited as another reason to deploy these Patriot missiles. Is that really a serious threat? Isn't the worry that, well, if there is a power vacuum, what happens to these alleged chemical weapons? That's the worry, isn't it?
Now, I'm glad you raised the issue about chemical weapons, because there's a few points to be made. One, this is an obvious war propaganda trick by the NATO powers to justify in the minds of the public that a bombing campaign should be conducted by NATO, at least a no-fly zone, against the Ba'athist Syrian government. Okay. But the second point is that I've been to Vietnam, to the orphanages and to the government support centers of those children affected by Agent Orange because of the US bombing of Vietnam. We know what depleted uranium has done to Iraq in terms of the newborns' deformities, and Winston Churchill was the first leader of any power to use chemical weapons against what he called the savage tribes in Iraq in the early 1920s. So really putting some historical context to it.
Depleted uranium, also known as Q metal, D38, and Du, is a toxic and radioactive byproduct created in the production of enriched uranium for nuclear weapons and nuclear energy. It has a radioactive half-life of 4.4 billion years. The U.S. and NATO militaries began using bullets made of depleted uranium in 1991 in the Persian Gulf War, and they have continued using it in every major armed conflict since that time. Du is used because it is extremely dense, 1.6 times as dense as lead, which makes it ideal for piercing heavy armor. Just to give you an idea of how much this is being used, the U.S. fired 640,000 pounds of Du ammunition in the first Gulf War alone. In the initial 2003 invasion, they used an estimated 4 million pounds. When a depleted uranium shell hits its target, it explodes on impact, burning at extremely high temperatures, vaporizing into an ultrafine aerosol with a large percentage of the particles as small as 1/10 of a micron in size. To put that in perspective, these are literally as small as viruses. This depleted uranium dust spreads out into the atmosphere, where it finds its way into water and food supplies, and is inhaled by both soldiers and civilians living and moving throughout the area. Studies have shown that upon inhalation, these particles are small enough to pass through the nose, through the olfactory nerves, and into the brain, where it accumulates. Depleted uranium also accumulates in the bones and teeth due to the fact that the body replaces calcium with it. Governments that use Du always like to portray it as safe by referring to how solid chunks don't emit enough radiation to be harmful from a distance. But this defense fails to account for the fact that these microscopic radioactive particles, once absorbed into tissues, are in direct contact with cells throughout the body. And once it's in the body, there is no way to remove it, nor can these microscopic particles be removed from the environment at large. And remember, depleted uranium remains radioactive for over 4.4 billion years. One of the hidden tragedies of the Iraq wars has been the marked increase in birth defects, nervous system anomalies, and cancer rates. In some areas, birth defect rates have been shown to have increased by 15 times what they were before the war. It's also worth noting that after the Gulf War, thousands of soldiers became chronically ill and have never recovered. This condition is officially called Gulf War syndrome. The U.S. government denies that this illness has any connection with DU, even though soldiers far from the front lines have been found to have large quantities of these radioactive particles in their system. Now, given these facts, you would think that countries that claim to care about human rights would condemn the use of depleted uranium weaponry. However, there have been multiple attempts to impose a moratorium on its use over the years, but France, Britain, the US, and Israel have consistently blocked such proposals. The next time you hear one of these governments or the mainstream media of one of these countries talking about chemical or nuclear weapons that some country may have or be planning to build, Keep that in mind.
The planned multi-billion-dollar U.S. missile defense shield in Europe might not be able to protect America from possible Iranian airstrikes. The flaws were highlighted in classified studies made by the Defense Department, prepared for a congressional briefing. For more on this, we are now joined live by Bruce Gagnon, a coordinator of the Global Network Against Weapons and Nuclear Power in Space. Bruce, thank you very much for being with us. Now, first, let's get right to this. If the complex is flawed, why is it still on the cards to be built in the first place?
Well, first off, and most importantly, I don't think it was ever intended to protect against Iranian missiles, something, in fact, that do not even exist today. Iran has no nuclear weapons, nor do they have the capability to launch a missile all the way to the United States. So I think the so-called missile defense system, which in fact is a key part of U.S. first strike strategy, it's the shield to be used after the sword has lunged into the heart of Russian and Chinese nuclear forces. And clearly this missile defense system has always been about surrounding Russia and China. And that's why the math doesn't work when you look at having it protect against an Iranian system.
Now, one of the flaws that has been mentioned is the actual location of the system in Romania and Poland, something that we all know that Russia has been voicing their concerns about. Can we expect any changes on the location issue?
I don't think so. In fact, as NATO is expanding in its encirclement of Russia, I think we're only going to see more of these so-called, again, missile defense deployments into various NATO countries. So I think the ones in Poland and Romania, and now there's a radar going into Turkey, these are going to stay, but I think attempts are going to be made to put these systems into places like Georgia and other countries very close to the Russian borders, which in fact is only going to increase tensions between the United States and Russia, as is happening in China today, as the U.S. is encircling China with these same missile defense systems. The Aegis destroyers, the Navy destroyers that are outfitted with these missile defense interceptors, are going to be put into the Black Sea, the Baltic Sea, Mediterranean Sea, really increasing the encirclement of Russia in the years ahead. And in fact, as the new generations of these interceptor missiles are built, they're going to become even more technologically sound, sophisticated, much faster, and that will only make the problem worse.
Well, given that the billions of dollars have already been spent on the system in its current state, it's now showing serious flaws. Does it make sense to spend any more money on this? Will the U.S. invest more?
I think it's a bad expenditure, of course, as our economy is collapsing here at home in the United States. We're wasting enormous amounts of money on the military-industrial complex. So clearly I'm opposed to these systems. But looking at how this oligarchy runs our country today, how the corporations control our Congress, I think it's clear that Congress will continue to support these systems. The new Secretary of Defense that Obama has nominated, Chuck Hagel, former Republican senator from Nebraska, was one of the co-sponsors in the Senate of the missile defense program. So he clearly is a strong ally of this system. And I think that he is being brought into running the Pentagon partly because of that relationship. What we're seeing right now is some criticism from the Republicans about this particular system, but there's a competition going on for various missile defense projects. The Boeing Corporation has projects that the Bush administration favored. The Obama administration has favored ones that are being manufactured by Raytheon and General Dynamics. And so really, what little argument we see in the Congress is more about which corporations are going to get the big contracts in the years ahead.
Now, Russia is warning it could make a preemptive strike against NATO's anti-missile defense shield planned for Europe if the US persists in going ahead, ignoring the Kremlin's opposition. Moscow says the system threatens its national security and is detailing its concerns at an international conference in the Russian capital with representatives from over 50 nations. Well, RT's Anissa Nawe joins us live now with more on this. Anissa, what exactly is Russia hoping to demonstrate at this international gathering?
Well, missile defense has been in a deadlock for some time now between the U.S., Russia, and NATO. And basically, Russian officials have already reiterated that sentiment, saying that if that deadlock is not resolved sometime in the near future, of course, they understand how much work needs to be done, that they will have to take responsive measures. Like you said, a preemptive strike. If there is no response from the U.S. or from NATO, this has been an issue for many years now, and Russia has made it very clear that a missile defense system, which started as planned, is already pretty much fully fledged underway in Eastern Europe, in Poland, Romania, even as far as Turkey. Russia sees that as a major threat to its national security, and officials here basically saying that they will have to move forward and take steps to protect themselves if they don't see a response from their partners. U.S. and in NATO. Washington, for years, has been trying to convince Russia that the system is not against them, that it's meant to be a deterrent against so-called rogue states like Iran and North Korea. Well, officials at this summit are going to show basically the results of research that they've done to prove that they believe both North Korea and Iran don't have the capability to reach Europe. So major questions surrounding the goals of that defense system so close to the Russian border. We also know that they're going to show a computer model of how that missile defense system affects Russian systems just outside its border, of course, especially in Poland. So real concern here from the Russian side and harsh rhetoric in response to that lack of response from the U.S. and from NATO. We're hearing a lot of similar statements about how dialogue has to happen, but really what officials needs to see, and we're hearing this certainly from the Russian side, is some kind of compromise. The way Russia sees it, the way out of this, is only if there's some kind of joint system between NATO and the Russian Federation, and that is something that hasn't gotten quite positive response from the U.S. Or from NATO officials, continuing to try to prove their point, really, about why they believe this is such a threat to Russia's national security. With that said, no major breakthroughs are expected. It's an election year. Let's not forget that open mic in South Korea when President Obama told Medvedev to hang in there, that compromises could come after the election, and it's election year, of course, in many countries across the globe in 2012. So we have to take that into consideration. And also the fact that invited to this summit, but not taking up on that invitation, was NATO Secretary General Anders Fogh Rasmussen, who declined, but his spokesperson saying that that in no way represents his openness or readiness for dialogue. But that's not going to be taken as a very good sign ahead of an upcoming major NATO summit in Chicago at the end of this month. What it seems like we're going to hear from officials as this two-day summit wraps up is that there needs to be baby steps, that this is a difficult issue. Both sides are going to push to the end to defend their interests.
Talk more on the Russia and America dialogue about missile defence is the Paris-based political analyst John Lachlan, joining us now indeed from Paris. John, hi there. NATO says the missile shield poses no threat to Russia because Moscow's intercontinental ballistic missiles are, quote, too fast and too sophisticated for this planned system to intercept. It's not convincing Moscow, though, is it? Does it convince you?
It doesn't convince me, no, and I find it pretty rich, actually, that the Americans should be saying this about their missile system when they refuse to listen to the Iranians, who say that their civilian nuclear program poses no threat whatever to anybody. Threats are a matter of perception, but also of reality. And the fact is that, as far as we know, Iran has no nuclear weapons capability and doesn't plan one, while the Americans are planning a missile shield, which, although it may not, they may be telling the truth when they say it's not directed against Russia, the fact is it's a new weapons system, and it can be presumably directed against Russia in a matter of seconds. So no, it doesn't convince me.
There was comment earlier on from a French defence official saying that Iran's nuclear program poses a, quote, risk rather than a threat to Europe's security. What does it mean by that? Is there a point, therefore, of having the shield if it's just a risk?
Well, I don't really know what the official means, and in any case, I don't personally share that analysis. I don't think that Iran is going to attack a European country, still less the United States of America. That seems to me to be an absolute fantasy. It's not my view. And in any case, but part of my answer is that one of the reasons why I think that it won't do that is that the costs in terms of retaliation of such an attack, were it to happen, are obviously immense. So Iran would have to be mad to launch such an attack. And that's why I find the whole discussion about the missile shield and the Iranian hypothetical attack completely fantastic.
Russia's been trying to talk reason here for a long time now. I mean, the latest words today, though, certainly ramping up the rhetoric, if you like. Russia's saying it could make a preemptive strike if, quote, very importantly, the situation worsens and reaches a critical point. What is that critical point?
Well, the critical point would be if there was some kind of conflict looming between the United States and Russia, and if there was some prospect of missiles being fired at Europe or across Europe to America. We're obviously a very long way away from that, at least I hope we are. The reason why the Russian minister made this remark, why the Russian defense official made this remark, is to show the logical conclusion of what the Americans are doing. The Americans are planning to install new military hardware on the continent of Europe, a continent which has struggled now for 20 years to rid itself of the inheritance of the Cold War. And the logical military implication of that act is that at some point a strike might have to be contemplated.
Will those words from Russia today make any difference? Do you think the US will take Russia's ultimatum seriously, given, of course, that any preemptive strike would be far away, I guess, from American soil?
Well, the fact that it's far away from American soil doesn't really make any difference, because it's an American system, and the Americans are trying to obviously extend their influence either through directly or through NATO over the whole of the European continent and on other continents as well. So the fact that any such attack wouldn't actually hit America is of no consequence at all. Would the Americans be bothered by the ultimatum? I think they should be. As I say, I don't think we are looking at a military conflict at any time soon, but I think they have to understand that this missile defense system is very serious. They may say it doesn't affect Russia or isn't intended against Russia, but like any weapons system, frankly like a knife, it depends on who is holding it and on the circumstances of the moment.
Really, really briefly, if at the moment anyway the US still won't give legal guarantees that this shield won't breach Russia's national security, what is the way forward, do you think, to break this defense stalemate?
The way forward is either for the Americans to integrate Russia into the unified command of the defense system, of the missile shield, or to abandon it completely.
Bruce, the U.S. isn't ruling out giving Moscow legal binding guarantees that its missile defense shield won't be directed against Russia. But it says a cooperation agreement should be signed first. Does it look like the impasse will be broken soon?
I don't think so. I think the U.S. intends to continue surrounding Russia and China with these so-called missile defense systems, claiming that they're really aimed at Iran. But we know that Iran has no nuclear weapons today, and they have no missiles capable of hitting the United States. So indeed, this system is aimed at Russia. I believe it has a lot to do with the fact that Russia has the world's largest supply of natural gas. And don't we know by now that the Pentagon's primary job today is to serve as a resource extraction service on behalf of corporate globalization.
Why do you think Washington is so slow in giving Russia these guarantees?
because I don't think they intend to give Russia those guarantees. In fact, what I see happening now inside the United States, using the mainstream media, I see Russia and China being demonized over and over again by the U.S. I think the strategy is to make the American people feel that Russia and China are the aggressors. We find that it's virtually impossible to get any mainstream media coverage over this U.S. encirclement of Russia and China. I just finished a 30-day speaking tour from San Diego and California all the way to Seattle and Washington, 24 cities, where I spoke about this very U.S. encirclement with missile defense systems of Russia and China, and the mainstream media would not touch this issue and the speaking tour that I did. So the American people really know very little about it, but instead we hear a lot about how Russia and China are expanding their military, which of course is happening largely because the U.S. is militarily encircling both those countries today.
Now, Moscow says it will develop brand new weapons to counter the missile shield over concerns the shield could intercept current technology. Does this have the hallmarks of a new arms race here?
Sadly, I think it does. I'm against any country developing more weapons these days. We don't need a new arms race. We have a big problem on this planet called climate change that we need all the countries of the world to help deal with. But in fact, when you're being surrounded, as Russia and China is today, one begins to understand why they feel the need to increase their military, especially when the United States Space Command is wargaming a first strike attack on China every year now for the past several years, set in the year 2016. So, in fact, when they're wargaming a first strike attack at the same time that Russia and China are being surrounded, you can understand why those two countries feel like they have to respond.
A lot of military hardware in the area already in place. How possible is it that an attack on Iran is really being considered?
Well, I think we have to be very cautious how we analyze that news. There was a front page article in the London Daily Mail yesterday saying that the US and the UK were drawing up joint plans to attack Iran. Now, this has been going on for more than 4 years now. These permanent threats against Iran on the part of Israel, who are calling for a preemptive strike. That's what Mr. Netanyahu said only 2 days ago. And it all coincides with the debacle of Israeli attack on southern Lebanon in 2006. So I think we have to be very cautious and basically understand that what Iran is the cornerstone of probably what is an ongoing, very tough negotiation to move forward towards a world government where Russia and China are not going to bow in very easily to the Western powers. And Iran is the cornerstone because contrary to Iraq, which was on its own, Saddam Hussein, contrary to Libya and Afghanistan, Iran has definitely a very strong commercial and trade agreement with China, and it has a very strong trade agreement with Russia, and although it's not official, it probably has some sort of military alliance with Russia too. So I think that what we are seeing is we are probably edging closer to what might become a full-fledged war in the region, even a world war where Iran is the cornerstone if it is attacked by Israeli, American, British, or a combination of all three forces in the near future.
It is very interesting how you bring Russia and China into this, basically describing the massive trade agreements between Iran and China and Russia. Certainly, if the West did try and attack Iran, it would certainly flare tempers in two of the biggest world powers, that of Russia and China. Now, moments ago, you mentioned the issue of Israel. If Israel did unilaterally attack Iran, as we know just a few days ago, it test-fired this new intercontinental missile, do you think America would have to support its closest ally? Would it have to be involved?
America supports Israel unconditionally in the diplomatic, strategic, military, financial spheres. There is a whole line of thought in America from academic Stephen Walt of Harvard University and John Mearsheimer of Chicago University that says that Zionist influence through AIPAC, the American Israeli Public Affairs Commission, is so strong that it has succeeded in making American foreign policy prioritize the national interest of Israel over the national interest of the United States. Now, the United States is not so much bent on war, public opinion, against Iran, but Israel is. So one can envision that Israel is a wild card. It might unilaterally attack Iran. It will then bear a counterattack, which will be ferocious, from Iran against Israel. And then the Western media will plan the whole thing out so that it will drag public opinion from America and Europe to support Israel. And what can happen after that is anybody's guess, because we don't know what Russia will do. We don't know what China will do. We don't even know what Pakistan and India will do.
Now,
and they are nuclear powers.
So you bring in the more regional and even a global perspective here. But we saw the American-backed NATO effort in Libya. Just over the past week or so, we've been seeing the reports from a UN nuclear watchdog about Syria and an alleged nuclear plant there that actually for the past 2 decades has been a cotton mill. Now the UN nuclear watchdog talking about a possible strike on Iran. Just what is the geopolitical global agenda here coming from the West?
Well, I think that basically we have a global power elite that is embedded in the United States, embedded in the United Kingdom, and in many countries of Europe, but is not part of the United States, Britain, and the European Union. They are bent on world government, and they use the U.S. military prowess to try to achieve that, and NATO's prowess to try to achieve that. Now, what we have seen in Libya is very different from what can happen with Iran, because Gaddafi committed the same mistake that Saddam Hussein is, and that's being alone in the crossfire. But Iran is not Iraq, Iran is not Libya, and things will be very different. And I even believe that perhaps in their desperation, they are looking towards a World War III scenario, because as happened with World War II, it is an opportunity to kick the chessboard and reshuffle all the cards. And I suppose that this global power elite bent on world government will try to reshuffle all the cards in their favor.
No such place. The British forces, American forces, NATO forces, they're around us everywhere. They're surrounding Iran. And those same forces say Iran is interfering in the internal affairs of the region. What can we say to that?
Dr. Tang Dan-kun, you're the Director and Research Fellow of the Center for Arms Control, China Institute of International Studies, and it's great to have you with us today.
Yeah, me too.
So Russia and China have found themselves recently in the same camp trying to prevent a possible military intervention into Syria. Do you think it's a short-lived partnership, or maybe a greater strategic vision that could actually consequently affect the distribution of power worldwide?
Since we share the same responsibility, we're facing the same challenges. For example, we learn lessons from the Libya case. Last year, the military intervention by the Western countries did give us lessons. How can we safeguard the peace and stability in regional affairs? So this time, I'm sure the two countries can exchange their ideas toward the regional dispute to prevent any conflict or war.
Well, one occasionally still hears that the Western countries still may invade Syria going around the UN resolution, like it has happened in Iraq, for example. What instruments do China and Russia, except their common standpoint on Syria, what other instruments do they have to actually prevent this from happening?
Yeah, China has been very active in the negotiations, in finding peaceful solution, not only Syria dispute, but also in Iran nuclear issue. China this time actually is a mediator or coordinator. I think China is acceptable to all the parties concerned, to Iran, to Russia, to the United States. To my knowledge, there were several rounds of dialogue, among the parties concerned related to the Iranian nuclear issue. And China changed a little bit its attitude to be more active at this time, because China's position, China's policy toward the regional affairs are more acceptable to all the parties concerned.
Another issue that China and Russia are commonly worried about is, of course, the American antimissile defense system. we're hearing about the United States plans to actually build an early warning radar in South Japan, and at the same time Russia is increasingly worried about United States plans to enhance its missile defense capabilities in Europe. Do you think that China and Russia could maybe come up with a joint reaction to this plan, or each country should deal with that on their own?
Yeah, actually, this is a question I asked to your Vice Foreign Minister, whether China and Russia can join together to establish a counting missile defense system. He didn't give me a direct answer. Maybe there are a lot of obstacles on the way for China and Russia to cooperate in this regard. For example, political obstacles and the technical obstacles. I don't think at this moment the two countries' militaries, prefer to share their missile information, data. Maybe Russia would like to share the information with the United States because you have a START treaty. But I think Russia and China now are facing the same challenge. The missile defense project, started 10 years ago, 20 years ago. Actually, in the eyes of your country, of Russian, of Chinese, is really a bad program, which will deteriorate or destroy the strategic stability among big powers.
How far do you think the United States is willing to go in confronting both Russia and China in this issue?
I think it's a strategic step by the United States from the two sides. Russia and China, live on the same continent, Euro-Asia continent, and from the Europe side, they deployed the missile defense system, in some European countries, and in Asia Pacific region, another side of the Euro-Asian continent. They deployed the missile defense system in Alaska, deployed the missile defense systems in Japan, South Korea, and even China's Taiwan. So they tried to squeeze the Eurasian continent. Actually, the two big powers, Russia and China, in the eyes of the United States nowadays are major challenges for their security. So this time, the United States just try to contain the two countries. Of course, missile defense is not only a military project. I think it's a political project. It's also a technical project. So this time, I don't think this is a good project for the international relations at this moment.
The economic crisis in Eurozone is another huge topic that has actually really got to everyone around, and it has also undermined Chinese demand in Chinese export. But on the other hand, it's an opportunity for the Chinese to invest. So maybe could this, for you, this crisis be more an opportunity than a problem?
I think a Chinese attitude toward the European crisis, financial crisis, has been very cautious. There are a lot of seminars and workshops and a lot of ideas whether China should give financial support, economic support to the financial crisis zone, especially the European countries. But I think so far the Chinese government has been very cautious toward these ideas. I can give you another example. Trade with our neighboring countries, with Japan. We are now suffering the island dispute. During the previous year, but the trade between the two countries is still increasing, even today.
On the back of this crisis, when everyone's talking about the possible recession in European economy, you hear people talk more and more about the fact that Russia needs to turn towards the east at this point. So if that was to happen, if Russia were to turn itself towards China, how would that change the very face of the Russian-Chinese relationship if we were to forge that economic tie?
China actually has been the engine of world economy at least for 30 years. So I think your policy toward Asia Pacific region, especially toward China, is a good choice. In economic cooperation in trade. Actually, I think the two countries, though we are neighbors, not so good. In economy, our trade with Japan, with ASEAN nations increased very fast. But I think Sino-Russian economic relations are not as good as the relations, the trade with Japan, with ASEAN nations. So we have much room to do more cooperation in this regard, in economy and trade.
Moving on now, the war rhetoric from Washington towards Iran is again being ramped up just ahead of the second round of high-level international talks on the country's nuclear program. US military top brass claimed they would need just 3 weeks to defeat Iran's armed forces. Our TV's Ganesh Chakan looks at whether it's just more tough talk or preparation for real action.
The Pentagon says they're just doing some contingency planning in case Iran attempts to close the Strait of Hormuz or attacks U.S. ships in the Persian Gulf. But analysts say it's the kind of planning that drives the tensions to a whole new level. Now, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that Iran is encircled militarily. Here is Iran, and here are the countries in red where the U.S. has military presence. We tried to put on the map those U.S. bases which have been reported about. They are in flashing blue here. Here you have the friendly Arab countries. Right next to Qatar, it's Bahrain, which hosts the U.S. Fifth Fleet. That's 40 ships, 16,000 personnel, 2 huge aircraft carriers. Kuwait, which right after the drawdown in Iraq, the U.S. There has increased the size of standby combat force. America's Air Force, Army, Navy, and Marines are boldly positioned in Oman and the United Arab Emirates. That's to the south of Iran, in Turkey and Israel to the west, and Afghanistan and Pakistan in the east. Most recently, the U.S. Air Force has dispatched a number of F-22 Raptor strike fighters to a base in the United Arab Emirates. And here it is, the brand new penetrating strike fighter. The move has caused backlash from Tehran. In addition to the hardware, the U.S. Central Command says there are about 125,000 U.S. troops in close proximity to Iran, not to mention new drone bases at undisclosed locations also in the region. U.S. officials say an enhanced presence in the Gulf is meant to serve as a, quote, quick reaction contingency force, not simply as a prelude to war. But the buildup seems to exacerbate the hostile talk, which may at one point turn into an all-out confrontation. The Iranian military is, of course, no match to the American military might. After all, we're talking about the country that spends on its military more than the next 10 top defense spending countries combined. So crushing Iran is in America's power, but most analysts agree. What's also in its power is producing the kind of instability in the region that would be far worse than what came out of Iraq and Afghanistan.
The European Union has imposed tough new sanctions on Iran in a fresh effort to exert pressure over its nuclear program. But Britain, France and Germany have also stressed that they're willing to negotiate if Tehran immediately suspends its atomic activities and respects its international obligations. The EU's Foreign Affairs chief also suggested the door remains open for talks to resolve the situation.
I want to stress, however, that sanctions are not an end in themselves. I've often talked about this being part of a twin-track approach, that the purpose of sanctions is to put pressure on Iran to come back to the negotiating table.
Iran has described the move as psychological warfare and warned it will worsen the standoff over the Islamic State's nuclear program. One minister even threatened the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, but American, French and British warships have all passed through today without any incident.
Iran has been ready for cooperation with the IAEA to remove the ambiguities. During our time, you remember, in 2003 to 2005, we implemented additional protocol. We implemented subsidiary arrangement code 3.1. We even suspended the enrichment. We gave access to the IAEA beyond additional protocol. We opened the military sites to the IAEA. But the EU3 was not able to recognize the legitimate rights of Iran because the US position was zero enrichment. That's why negotiations during our time failed, despite the fact we were ready for full transparency, and we proved practically. During President Ahmadinejad, Russia in 2011 proposed a step-by-step plan. The Russian step-by-step plan consisted of all major requirements of the IAEA, Atomic Energy Agency, and United Nations Security Council resolutions, and even beyond. But Iranian officials, they welcomed the Russian initiative as a base for negotiations. It was the US and the Europe which declined the Russian proposal. Therefore, I believe, again, even today, the Russian proposal can be a good base for negotiations.
You personally worked with IAEA monitors in Iran for several years, and while the international observers are known to have accused Iran of not letting them see everything they want, while Tehran has been saying that it can't satisfy all of their demands. Who is right?
It depends. Iran is a member of Safeguard. They are asking Iran to implement additional protocol. Implementing additional protocol is not mandatory for the nations, for the countries. Today, 70 countries, they do not implement additional protocol. Therefore, this would be a gesture, a goodwill from Iran to implement additional protocol. The IAEA is even requesting Iran to give access to the IAEA beyond additional protocol. No nation in this world has given access to the IAEA beyond additional protocol. I believe Iran is ready if they recognize the rights of Iran for enrichment like any other member of NPT, and if they are prepared ultimately to lift the sanctions, to start lifting the sanctions gradually, at the end state to lift all sanctions. If the West and the P5+1 are ready on these two issues, I believe Iran would show goodwill to accept additional protocol, to cooperate with the IAEA on possible military dimension issues, which would need to give access to the IAEA beyond additional protocol.
Buildup is in the works. Thousands of U.S. troops now gearing up to go to Israel. The military is calling it an exercise, not a deployment. But this is one serious exercise. This, as Israel says, they're ready to go to war with Iran. So what's really going on here? Jamal Abdi is in studio to dig deeper into this. Welcome, Jamal. So the U.S. is tightening ties with Israel. What is happening?
Well, what is happening on its face is that the U.S. is working to reassure Israel, to reassure Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states that we have their backs, that we have this security blanket in the region, and that they don't have to worry about Iran as a threat. But as we can see, we're getting closer and closer to war with Iran. Anybody who argues that this, kind of extraordinary confluence of events, the planned exercises by the U.S. and Israel, the exercises that Iran was doing in the Persian Gulf, anybody that argues that those aren't sort of part of a lead up to eventual military confrontation, I think is probably running out of arguments at this point. And the reason that this is happening is that this is the logical conclusion of our current strategy against Iran. We have sanctions in place with no diplomacy. The only way that that ends is through confrontation.
They are calling this particular buildup a deployment, an exercise, and not a deployment. But is there more to it?
Well, this is something that has been planned for quite a while now. It's not the first time that this sort of exercise has been done with Israel. But what is being planned is actually, back in September, the U.S. actually provided Israel with an advanced radar, and for the first time actually permanently deployed U.S. troops to Israel. That was a small contingent, though, of a couple hundred troops. What we see now, though, is this much larger exercise, not unprecedented, but definitely something that is going to have an impact right now as we see this sort of tit for tat in confrontation between the U.S. and Iran.
So we are seeing a lot in that region, as you just mentioned, this permanent presence, and now this massive military exercise.
Yeah, and this is to set up, this is for a contingency plan, but I would argue that this is a contingency plan that we're going to see enacted if we don't find a way to change course. The idea is that were there to be a massive war in the Middle East, presumably with Iran, that we would be ready to have set up command within Israel and actually have Israel set up a command center in Europe at the U.S. European Command.
And Israel at this point seems both ready and willing to go to war with Iran. So if they do, I mean, will the U.S. automatically join them?
Well, that's the funny thing. Some have said that the Obama administration believes that it could distance itself from an Israeli strike on Iran. And there have been these sort of public leaks in which U.S. officials have said Israel wouldn't notify us until jets were scrambled and in the air before they struck Iran. But that being said, given that we're doing this massive military exercise, given that the U.S. has actually, under Obama in 2009, actually provided Israel with these bunker busters that presumably would be used against Iranian nuclear facilities, I think it's going to be very difficult to not be implicated, for the U.S. not to be implicated in an Israeli strike on Iran. And so I don't see a scenario in which this happens and we are not forced into some sort of all-out war.
So you're saying the likelihood is if Israel goes, the U.S. will go?
Absolutely. And that's I mean, Iranian officials have said this. They're going to consider any strike by Israel a strike by the United States.
Now, this huge buildup is happening as President Obama just today announced that there's supposed to be this big reduction in military spending. And in order to do that, he's bringing the troops home from Iraq, from Afghanistan. But now we're seeing this possible military conflict with Iran. So is it possible that this isn't really much of a drawdown or a shrinking of military, but just a redirecting of resources?
Well, you'll recall that under Bush, we didn't consider the Iraq or Afghanistan wars as military spending. They were a separate budget item. And I would argue that you can't actually reduce military spending unless we actually have a strategic realignment that puts more of a focus on diplomacy. We can't continue the policies of the Bush administration and of previous administrations when it comes to Iran, policies that can only end in military confrontation. If we don't change those, we're going to end up spending the money that previous administrations would have spent on a war. We're locked into this trajectory.
And one method that the U.S. is using are these sanctions, but some argue that these sanctions are in themselves an act of war.
Well, Iran has said that they would consider sanctions on their oil exports and sanctions on their central bank an act of war. I think it could be reasonably argued that the covert attacks within Iran, and frankly, some of the things that Iran does could all be considered acts of war, and that there is a Cold War going on. There's also an economic war going on against Iran. So I think that we do have a low-scale war right now, and the question is, does that actually escalate out of control into a full-scale war? And I'll say that, what's happening now with Iran, people are calling it desperation. They're saying that what's happening is actually a sign that the sanctions are working. But I think that begs the question, what are the sanctions intended to do? If they're working to bring us closer to war, then absolutely they are working.
This isn't just about nuclear weapons. If it were about nuclear weapons in the Middle East, then the United States would have a bone to pick with Israel, which is the only power in the Middle East which actually possesses nuclear weapons. It's not about that. That's the casus belli. But the reason for this continued conflict is because the American administration simply can't live with an Iran which has as much regional power as it has at the moment. You see, the Americans, when they look at the Iranian regime, regime, they see its links with Syria, they see its links with Hamas, they see its links with Hezbollah. And this is a challenge to American power in an absolutely critical, economically critical, geopolitically critical area of the globe. And it's that which is the sticking point for the American administration, in my view.
Just briefly, how bad could this get? We're hearing now the UK supported Washington's rhetoric, saying its warships are at the ready to prevent any attempt by Iran to hinder trade through that crucial Strait of Hormuz. Could this go further, do you think, develop into actual warfare?
Well, I think this is certainly in the minds of some of the players in the international community. We know that Israel, for instance, has had test flights out into the Mediterranean for exactly the same distance as there is between Tel Aviv and Tehran, with a view to having a strike on the nuclear facilities. And we know that even the Bush administration in its last months had to restrain the state of Israel from doing this. So we know that there are some people, hawks in Israel, hawks in the United States, who want to settle this militarily. And it does seem to me that once we begin on the process of implementing sanctions, of Iran responding to the sanctions, that there will be calls further down the road for a direct military conflict. And that, in this case, is even more dangerous than it was in the case of Iraq.
I frankly think that crisis initiation is really tough. And it's very hard for me to see how the United States president can get us to war with Iran. Which leads me to conclude that if, in fact, compromise is not coming, that the traditional way of America gets to war is what would be best for U.S. interests. Some people might think that Mr. Roosevelt wanted to get us into World War II, as David mentioned. You may recall we had to wait for Pearl Harbor. Some people might think Mr. Wilson wanted to get us into World War I. You may recall he had to wait for the Lusitania episode. Some people might think that Mr. Johnson wanted to send troops to Vietnam. You may recall we had to wait for the Gulf of Tonkin episode. We didn't go to war with Spain until the until the Maine exploded. And may I point out that Mr. Lincoln did not feel he could call out the Federal Army until Fort Sumter was attacked, which is why he ordered the commander at Fort Sumter to do exactly that thing which the South Carolinians had said would cause an attack. So if, in fact, the Iranians aren't going to compromise, it would be best if somebody else started the war. One can combine other means of pressure with sanctions. I mentioned that explosion on August 17th. We could step up the pressure. I mean, look, people, Iranian submarines periodically go down. Someday one of them might not come up. Who would know why? We can do a variety of things if we wish to increase the pressure. I'm not advocating that. But I'm just suggesting that this is not a either-or proposition of, it's just sanctions has to succeed or other things. We are in the game of using covert means against the Iranians. We could get nastier at that.
The whole world is saying Iran violate UN Security Council resolutions. They're continuing to race towards the development of nuclear bombs.
Canada has sparked international reaction after shutting its embassy in Tehran and pulling out all of its diplomats. The government says one of the reasons was that it feared for their safety, but that the move goes far beyond the staff in Tehran. According to Foreign Affairs Minister John Baird on Friday, Iran isn't just a threat to Canadian diplomats.
Canada views the government of Iran as the most significant threat to global peace and security in the world today.
For Baird, Iran is a global menace, and he's not alone.
Iran's pursuit of nuclear weapons capability presents an intolerable threat to Israel, to America, and to the world.
We remain deeply concerned about Iran's nuclear program.
Right now, the biggest threat we're all facing is Iran's plans to develop nuclear weapons capability.
World leaders have repeatedly warned that they are willing to do anything to prevent Iran from getting the bomb, even go to war.
In the longer term, we take nothing off the table.
The President and I have said nothing is off the table.
When I say all options are at the table, I mean it.
So far, there's no proof Iran's nuclear program is anything but peaceful. But according to the UN, the country has dramatically increased the production of enriched uranium that could be used for a bomb. For Israeli leaders, that's proof enough. They now openly discuss attacks on Iran's nuclear facilities, and they expect the U.S. to back them up.
the United States is not certain whether or not Israel will strike Iran before the presidential elections.
Baird says he knows nothing about a strike against Iran, but with Canada's grievances with Iran going back years, many are asking, why cut ties now? To talk about this, we're joined by Janice Stein, director of the Munk School of Global Affairs. She's here in Toronto. In Washington, Aaron David Miller. He served 2 decades as an advisor to Republican and Democratic secretaries of state and as a scholar at the Wilson Center. And in New York, author Houman Majd. So, Janice, start with you. Why cut ties now?
3 reasons coming together, Wendy. One is, in fact, that our diplomats in Tehran, there were only 7. We had a charge d'affaires there, and they were totally shut out. They had no access to the Iranian government at all over the last several months. There are Iranian Canadians who are in jail. Our staff on the ground were absolutely unable to do anything for them, and the operation was costing $7 million. The department's in the midst of budget cutting. So there's some pressure there, but I don't think that's enough. The second reason, growing concern about what the Iranian embassy, which was one of the largest, was doing on the ground in Canada.
What do you mean?
Specifically, allegations growing in intensity that they were monitoring, that's a careful word, the activities of Iranian Canadians.
But that happens all the time, does it not? I mean,
it did,
it
but
happened in the Libyan embassy, and even when we were sending planes over.
It did, but both of those were actually shut down, both the Libyan and the Syrian embassy, for that reason. And those complaints have become louder over the last several months. And the third reason, probably the icing on the cake, was the meeting of the non-aligned group in Tehran, in which large numbers showed up. And this probably was an attempt by the Harper government, which was displeased by Ban Ki-moon's attendance, to send a strong counter message.
What's your take on this, Houman? Why now?
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, maybe it's to do with the Ben Affleck movie coming out soon. Or, I mean, you know, that's. I mean, I say that I don't mean to be flippant, but actually, if Canada is concerned about its diplomats in Iran, it is possible, given what happened to the British embassy back in November of last year, that a mob could attack the Canadian embassy over something as silly as a movie, about the Canadians rescuing American hostages back in 1979.
Will Iran care?
I'm not sure if that's a factor, but sorry.
But will it have any impact? Care? Will Iran care?
No, it'll care from the PR standpoint a little bit, but no, not really. There's hardly any trade between Canada and Iran. Iran doesn't consider Canada a force in international affairs. I think if this is followed by, and it's possible that the Canadians did this knowing that it was going to be followed by some other Western alliance countries doing the same thing, then yes, Iran will care then, I think.
Well, that's the thing, I suppose.
On its own, no.
Aaron, we heard from Benjamin Netanyahu today saying that he wants a coalition. He's been talking to the U.S. about drawing this red line, suggesting that Canada's part of this, although that's not what John Baird said. What about that idea, that it's time to say there is this line, and if you cross it, then we'll perhaps attack you?
Well, I think if the international community was serious about actually creating a red line that had identifiable components that could actually be measured, there were metrics to determine whether or not Iran had crossed it, and then if in fact the Iranians did cross it on the nuclear issue, the international community acting together would actually respond.
Is that going to happen?
They've responded with sanctions. They've tried negotiations. The reality is, look, I don't want to trivialize the Israeli concerns. I live in Chevy Chase, Maryland. I'm not sitting in downtown Tel Aviv or Jerusalem and listening to Iranian rhetoric on Israel as a cancer and Holocaust denial and an insult to humanity. But the reality is there's only one country in the world right now, in September 2012, that considers Iran an existential threat to Israel and that requires a war of necessity, and that is Israel. The rest of the international community is looking for every conceivable way, seems to be including the United States, I might add, to avoid a military confrontation. Certainly before the elections, our president in that regard is the not now president. He clearly does not want anything to happen before November. And I would argue he's not, his heart isn't in this one even between now and the end of the year. I think this is a 2013 problem. And I suggest to you that Netanyahu, constrained by the problems that any Israeli military operation would pose. That is to say, would it work given the risks? Number two, he can't get a consensus within his own country to act.
Okay, well, let me go to Janice here.
And number three's got the Americans telling him to be very careful. So I think he's looking for a way as well. The red line concept may be that way.
So, Janice, do you see anyone signing up for the Red Line Coalition? And would that even work?
You know, Wendy, the problem is that this term red line is a often used expression in Israeli political culture. Doesn't mean that much. Obama drew a red line. He said his red line was Iran could not have a nuclear weapon. That's not actually good enough.
So what's at play here? Then what's really happening?
Well, what is really happening is there's a profound disagreement between the United States and Israel about what is enough. For Netanyahu, what is enough is that Iran stop its enrichment to 20%, shut down Fardo, and export its uranium out of the country. And if they don't do that, those are the red lines he wants, then war.
And what about Canada's role in this? Is Canada being used to try and get support for this Red Line Coalition?
No, I don't think there is a Red Line Coalition. There is an argument about where the red line should be. Yeah. And Canada has made its views known, along with France, along with other European powers. They are very much in sympathy with the United States. Iran cannot be nuclear capable, but that's a big gap between where the Israeli government is and where the rest are.
So, Human, I mean, even if it's
actually, I think it's not. Oh, no, I was just going to say, no, Canada may have that view, but the United States has not said that Iran cannot be nuclear capable. They've just said, Obama has only said,
cannot have a nuclear weapon. Yes.
Some would argue today that Iran is already nuclear capable.
Nuclear weapons capable.
Right here.
The line beyond which lies war with Iran. Many thought Benjamin Netanyahu's message at the UN General Assembly this fall was addressed not so much to the international community, but to Washington.
Netanyahu would like to be able to communicate to the world that the Israelis are ready, which he has, to attack, and that it will be done with the full support of the United States. And he's not getting that.
The tension in the media peaked when President Obama practically referred to Israel's warmongering as noise that he's trying to black out.
Any pressure that I feel is simply to do what's right for the American people. And I am going to block out any noise that's out there.
Pledging full and unconditional support for Israel is part of any presidential election campaign in the U.S. The possibility of war with Iran adds a new dimension to this election season.
The Israelis will attack the Iranians. They will attack. It's just a matter of when. So Americans must decide which presidential candidate can better manage the situation.
Despite campaign bickering,
President Obama has thrown allies like Israel under the bus.
The last debate on foreign policy has shown the candidates hold almost identical views on the issue.
What if the Prime Minister of Israel called you on the phone and said, our bombers are on the way, we're going to bomb Iran? What do you say?
Bob, let's not go into hypotheticals of that nature. Our relationship with Israel, my relationship with the Prime Minister of Israel is such that we would not get a call saying our bombers are on the way.
When I've sent young men and women into harm's way, I always understand that that is the last resort, not the first resort.
Of course, a military action is the last resort.
As far as red lines for Iran,
I understand and share Prime Minister Netanyahu's insistence that Iran should not obtain a nuclear weapon.
My red line is Iran may not have a nuclear weapon. Iran as a nuclear nation is unacceptable to the United States of America.
President Obama said exactly the same thing.
29 standing ovations to the Israeli Prime Minister's speech before Congress, among other things, showed just how powerful the Israeli lobby is in Washington. Despite President Obama's support of a two-state solution for Israel and the Palestinians, his party members at their convention this fall called for moving the capital of Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. It remains evident that there is no daylight between the two parties of Israel.
Obama was the guy who gave the impression, with his Cairo speech and others, that he was willing to begin to renegotiate America's policy on Israel and Palestine. But in fact, when it came down to hard political realities, has backed off.
But will he back off when Israel decides to attack Iran?
You have psychopaths in charge.
And that's all it is. These are crazy people. I mean, how successful do they have to be? Look at the great job, I mean, of success that they create to create more wars. How could people let them get away with this? I say that, of course, facetiously. It's been a disaster in Iraq. What did it cost? $1 trillion, 1 million people killed in Iraq, their country destroyed. Every day you pick the paper up, 8 killed, 20 killed, 30 killed, 100 killed. Then you look at what's going on. Oh, by the way, it was a good reason to have that war. You know, Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction and ties to Al-Qaeda. They never existed, but who cares? And then, of course, there's the wonderful Afghan war, going on to be the longest war in American history. What's been accomplished there? Absolutely nothing, other than building up more hatred, killing a lot of people, and sacrificing the lives of our troops. Great. What are they showing now? 1 out of 2 American troops coming back either have a mental or a physical disability. So now they're going to start new ones. The United States has opened up. They have AFRICOM now in 35 African countries. The French have invaded Mali. They can't get over that trip, them French, you know? They can't get over the old French Sudan. Yeah, they had it only about, from 1896 to 1960. Oh, it couldn't be because of the uranium right next door in Niger that the Chinese and the people from India are going in and making deals with the dirt-poor Niger government to get their extraction of uranium out. Oh, it couldn't be because France has 75% of its energy coming from nuclear power, and now the people that own those natural resources want them for themselves. Could you imagine that? That's a good reason to bomb a country. And they could see the United States is opening up now fields in Africa to put drones in for more surveillance. And then you read the news coming out from the so-called terrorists to say, hey, there's going to be payback down the line. And we're warning you, it's going to hit France, it's going to hit the U.S., and other NATO countries that are supporting the interventions and occupations. And then, as I mentioned, look what's going on in Libya. Oh, I forgot to mention that brilliant strategic move by the U.S. military and the psychopaths in chief. You saw that wonderful clip of Hillary Clinton laughing. We came, he saw he died when she found out that Gaddafi was killed. I mean, my God, what kind of behavior is that? That's a human being? Boy, she makes the witches of Macbeth look tame. And so look at the job they did over in Libya, and look how it's all spilling over North Africa. Israel has the supreme right to defend itself, and every politician's repeating the same line. The United States Senate and the House voted unanimously in support of Israel in their massive attack on the Palestinians. Let's get this straight. I'm tired of hearing about these little bottle rockets that are going in there from the Palestinian side. Are they destabilizing things? Yes. But what has Israel done in the last year? Read back, review the trends journals, look at the map that we put up last week. They keep stealing Palestinian land and keep killing anybody from Hamas that they want. And then when Hamas strikes back with the only thing that they have, these little rockets that are about 1.5 feet taller than me and skinnier, Israel attacks with F-16s, with missiles, with gunboats shooting in there. Oh, and let's not forget this. Besides stealing the land, Gaza has been under siege by the Israelis for years. The place is a slum. It's one of the most populated places on earth. And nothing could come in and nothing could get out. And every time they kill a Palestinian, you know who these Palestinians are? They all have last names. They're Palestinian militants. They're all from the same family, the militant family.
How about resistance fighters? What gives Israel this right other than the United States and the Congress and the Senate? And I'm sick and tired of saying U.S. supports Israel. I'm a member of U.S. I pay my taxes. I don't support this. I don't support murder, whether it's in my country or anybody else's. And this is murder in the first degree. Israel keeps stealing Palestinian land, and they're enslaving the people in Gaza. They're in violation of international law and UN resolutions. The only time when the United States or the rest of the crony allies out there scream about breaking UN resolutions and then pummeling the hell out of them like they did to Gaddafi is when it's in their best interest. But Israel could do no wrong. And as I said, save your letters, complaints, cancel your subscription to the Trends Journal if you're Jewish and don't like what I have to say. This is not an attack on the Jewish people, any more than my criticism of the United States is an attack on the American people. It's an attack on the leadership of psychopaths and sociopaths that are ruling both countries. So let's get this straight.
The world lining up like we saw before the first two world wars. Am I wrong in intellectually, historically, but also in my gut, feeling the serious tremors in the force?
I think there are only two major sources of threat. One is the British monarchy, and the other is the British monarchy's puppet, which is Obama. The situation is that, as the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the United States have shown, they understand that any war that breaks out now, such as in the Middle East or elsewhere, will be a thermonuclear war. There may be other minor things and conflicts which are going on, but any time the force comes in and someone says we're going to start the attack, it's going to be a full global attack, and it's going to be thermonuclear. And the question is, will anybody survive eventually, not merely out of the war, because if you get the Soviet or Russian and Chinese capabilities, which are very significant, and against the United States and Britain and something from France, which is the other side. And these forces are going to go against each other on a thermonuclear basis from the get-go. And that means that our submarines, our major submarines, are going to launch in their time. It's going to be a full launch, probably 1 or 2 rounds. Maybe within an hour and a half, it's all over. And the world looks pretty dead. So we're at a point where the idea of simple war, or war breaking out, or incidents leading to war, is not going to happen. What's happened is Russia and China have made a very firm commitment not to start a war, but to defend against it. Most people in the United States want no part of this. The only person but really behind it is the president, Obama. And Obama's with the Queen, but most of the people in Britain are not for this nonsense either. So we're on the verge of the worst kind of warfare one could imagine, which would break out very suddenly, with very little warning on any part. Certain services, such as the U.S. services, would understand and know this is going on immediately.
Let me stop you there, sir, because what you're saying is obviously right on target, but people may not understand the last 2 chairmen of the Joint Chiefs, the last 3 heads of CENTCOM, as you know, people can look this up, journalists can look this up, have refused to attack Iran, saying it would bring in China and Russia. Now they've sent the fleets over to menace China, and they think that that's going to allow this attack. But now even Dempsey, who's been known as not as smart as his predecessors, has been convinced and came out, as you know, last week and said, hey, I mean, the exact quote, was a headline was, do not blame us when Israel strikes and don't think we're supporting it. So that type, I mean, to have chairman of the Joint Chiefs saying that shows that the military establishment who love wars. I mean, that's their. I mean, that's what they do. I mean, they love to be commanded off to war. Generally, are saying, "Do not do this." What? I mean, how significant is that? That signifies a mutiny within the saner sectors of the power structure.
I'm not sure the word mutiny is the right term. The point is, because nothing that the Joint Chiefs and others are doing to that effect is a violation of anything on their part.
Sure. I mean, that's the wrong term. It's a sanity call. What would you call it then?
The point is you've got to throw this president out of office. Even though he's just been nominated, I don't think it's going to stick. And he's not in a winning position right now.
But what does it mean inside the government, where you have so many connections, to have the chairman of the Joint Chiefs come out and say something countervailing what the president and certain sectors of Israel are pushing?
Yeah, but the Joint Chiefs are operating within their powers of government. And the president doesn't dare challenge that directly. Because the president is not a popular president. I mean,
am I right to say that it's seismic, though? I mean, how big of a deal is it to have the chairman of the Joint Chiefs come out, say that, and it gets almost no press?
You're talking about, if you're a member of the Joint Chiefs, and you're a patriot as I am, you're not going to play games and guessing games or anything with this policy. We know that any major war that breaks out on this planet will be a thermonuclear war. There are no minor wars possible. You cannot have a continuation of the war with the Middle East at all. Any such war will lead to thermonuclear war immediately. And that means that within about an hour and a half, most of the world is dead. And anyone who is competent, like the Joint Chiefs or other people of the same interests, our Russians or Chinese, all the same thing. This war must not occur. And if somebody tries to start it, we should get them out of the way quick. Because if we let this war happen, because we're in the age of thermonuclear warfare, and nobody can win thermonuclear warfare. The human race might go extinct within the aftermath of such an attack. So no sane person, and I wouldn't include this president as sane, no sane person wants to start such a war. There are other means we're going to have to use to deal with conflict. Many of the means are not conflict at all. They're just arguments about how we're going to settle things. But we've come to a time where we have to learn the truth. You cannot have war among major nations today. No sane head of government would launch it. But I think there are some people who are not so sane, including our current president.
Not satisfied with its missile shield in Europe, Washington has announced plans for a similar weapon system in Asia. A Pentagon official pointed at a perceived threat from North Korea as the main justification. But political activist and head of the New Patriotic Alliance, Renato Reyes, says that's a paper-thin excuse.
Clearly, the threat is being exaggerated by the United States. But we can see beyond the rhetoric that the real target here is China, and the U.S. wants to justify rebalancing most of its troops towards the Asian region. The so-called threats emanating from China are highly suspicious, questionable, and are in fact being twisted just so the U.S. can justify sending more troops and ships here in this region. Only intended to provide more justification for the permanent and expanded U.S. military presence in our region. That's another concern of ours. Will the U.S. missile shield provoke an arms race in the region? Will it provoke countries like China and North Korea into taking a tougher stance, into competing with the United States and deploying more war machines throughout Asia? And if that happens, that would be a bigger threat to peace.
Who spent most of last year cheering on Islamist rebels in Syria, has now taken the line that Islamist rebels in Mali are the biggest dangers to the world and we must intervene, that Britain must help France, regardless of the consequences to Britain. And I think it's a very misguided policy. Unfortunately, the political elite in Britain seem to be all behind his policy, which is very disturbing. But I think the public, speaking for the public, I think we're very concerned about what's going on.
Okay, well, let's break down why it's going on. What's in this for the UK? What is London looking to gain from this support for France?
Well, it's very interesting, isn't it? Because if we think back to 2011, it was David Cameron and William Hague, people like this, who were the loudest and most aggressive cheerleaders for the deposing of Colonel Gaddafi, who was the biggest bulwark against al-Qaeda in Northern Africa. And now the very same people, Cameron and Hague, are the ones saying we've got to get involved in the Mali operation to put down al-Qaeda groups there. And so there's a real inconsistency here, a real hypocrisy. You know, why, if fighting al-Qaeda in Africa is that the biggest task, why did we play such an active role in toppling the one leader in Northern Africa who actually was a bulwark against al-Qaeda? And sort of what's in it for Britain? I think that what's happening, Anissa, is that this al-Qaeda threat is being used as a smokescreen for the recolonization of Northern Africa by NATO forces, by France, Britain and the US.
Do you think that's why we're seeing the ignoring of the rise of al-Qaeda per se in Syria?
Absolutely, because of course it's one of the biggest myths in international relations is that the Western powers are implacably opposed to al-Qaeda over the last 20, 30 years. They're not. What they will use the al-Qaeda threat in some circumstances to intervene and invade certain countries like Afghanistan, but elsewhere they will actually back al-Qaeda militants to actually topple secular regimes like the one in Syria and in Libya. And so it's a Frankenstein's monster, and of course it all dates back to Afghanistan in the 1980s. And al-Qaeda and radical Islamic groups were used by the West to help topple the Red Army from Afghanistan, to help sort of defeat the Red Army in Afghanistan. And that's all part of the policy, I think.
Now, you mentioned that you think that this is all part of a bigger picture about the recolonization of Africa. How far do you think the British involvement will go in terms of Mali, as we're seeing so far?
Well, I fear we're going to be dragged more and more into it, because last week David Cameron was telling us that we just cannot allow Islamists to take power in Mali. And he can't sort of back down a few days later and say, well, it doesn't really matter if Islamists take power in Mali. So he sort of talked himself into a corner on this one by bigging up the situation there. So I very much fear, I mean, the neocons haven't got their war against Syria, their direct intervention against Syria. So now it seems as if we all sort of got to sort of support this intervention against Mali.
And it's interesting, they're kind of slowly moving from North Africa to West Africa, I think it's fair to say. Just briefly, Africa, of course, has untapped natural resources. There's no secret there. Which countries appear most interested, do you think, in securing those possible resources, expanding their interests? And do you think we could see any possible conflict of interest between Western countries?
Very possibly, because I think obviously France, from Monsieur Hollande's point of view, the economy is a very bad state in France, and I think he's hoping that a successful intervention in Mali will boost his popularity ratings back home. It's always been well documented, the uranium issue and how France needs uranium there, and Malawi is a big producer of uranium, so there are resources there. So I think France is very clear economic reasons, and I think economic reasons are behind every single Western intervention over the last 30 years. If we look back at Yugoslavia, the attack on Yugoslavia, the attacks on Syria, the Libyan war, all these were dressed up as humanitarian interventions, but they're not. They're economic interventions, and the West wants resources. The West wants to get control of resources in this region, and I think NATO is going to relocate to North Africa. I think that's clearly what this is all about. The al-Qaeda threat is being bigged up in order that when NATO leaves Afghanistan, it will relocate to North Africa.
According to the Associated Press, this year the U.S. military will be deploying an army brigade, codenamed the Dagger Brigade, to Africa to operate in small teams in 35 countries. The brigade will be under the control of General Carter Ham, head of the U.S. African Command. The official pretext for this move is to, quote, train countries to battle extremists and to give U.S. a ready and trained force to dispatch in Africa if crises requiring the U.S. military emerge. According to General Ham, mobilizing these forces for active combat would only require an order from Defense Secretary Leon Panetta. This announcement came as France began bombing missions in Mali earlier this year, followed by the deployment of ground troops, again under the pretext of fighting Islamic terrorism. It's important to note here that the government that France is backing was just recently established by the military in Mali, after a military coup which toppled the democratically elected government. The army, which has been accused of engaging in torture and sexual abuse of detainees, still retains real power. According to U.S. Defense Secretary Leon Panetta, the U.S. has been providing intelligence gathering assistance to the French in Mali. UK Special Forces are also involved in the operation. The grand irony here is that on one hand, NATO forces are taking military action against Islamic rebels. On the other hand, they are funding them and arming them in neighboring countries. In Syria, for example, France has openly supported the Syrian rebels in their attempts to destabilize the Syrian government, and has even offered to send the rebels anti-aircraft and heavy artillery. This in spite of German intelligence reports which have revealed that foreign al-Qaeda extremists have been behind a number of recent atrocities in Syria. These aren't just similar insurgents that are being funded in one country and battled in another. In many cases, they are the very same fighters. Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov was recently quoted as saying, "In Mali, France is fighting against those it armed in Libya against Gaddafi's regime, in violation of the UN Security Council arms embargo." To complicate matters, on January 30th, Israel bombed targets in Syria, under the pretext that Syria was sending weapons to its ally Hezbollah in neighboring Lebanon. In spite of this act of overt war, the Syrian government has not retaliated. They understand that any retaliation would be used by NATO to provide the justification for a full-scale invasion. Through all of this, Russia has continued providing weapons to the Syrian government and has made moves to counter the NATO missile defense shield outpost that was recently established in East Anatolia, Turkey, by building an array of anti-aircraft missiles pointed at Turkey. All of this would seem contradictory and absurd if we take NATO's official explanation at face value, but it makes perfect sense if you understand what's really at stake here. NATO is both funding and attacking Islamic extremists because the instability which results provides the pretext for a military presence. NATO's growing military presence in Africa and in the Middle East only makes sense when viewed as strategic positioning in the build-up to a much larger global conflict. In World War II, Africa, the Middle East, and the Caucasus region were key pivot points which both sides fought to control. Rich in oil, gold, and other key industrial resources, military domination in these areas was a determining factor in the outcome of the conflict. Hitler's invasion of Russia, for example, was driven by his desire to control the vast oil fields of the Caucasus region, the area between the Caspian and Black Seas, which includes Iran and Azerbaijan. Not surprisingly, this region was also highlighted in Zygmunt Brzezinski's book The Grand Chessboard, which outlined the key regions which must be controlled in order to ensure continued U.S. dominance. Israel and NATO's current attacks in Syria, combined with U.S. sanctions on Iran, which are openly geared towards destroying the Iranian economy, are part of a long-term policy of provocation. But what's really at stake in this provocation? Perhaps we should consider this statement by Major General Zhang Zhaozhang, who declared in late 2011 that, quote, "China will not hesitate to protect Iran, even with a third world war." Russia has issued numerous warnings of a similar nature, though the wording is slightly less direct.
You have a president that's signing executive orders like the King of England signs edicts during the revolution. And you don't like Fat Boy. And you want to see the war that I'm talking about, and that's the top trend for this one coming up. French hostage and 2 soldiers die in Somali rescue effort. Oh my God, a Somali rescue effort. Who could these guys be? Oh, I'll tell you who they were. A French intelligence officer was assassinated by his Islamic captors. Assassinated by his Islamic captors. What the hell is this guy doing there? Oh, don't raise your voice. They could do anything that they want. They're the French. They're the Americans. Oh, the Americans helped on this. Oh, yeah, the soldiers got killed. The guy that they were trying to rescue got killed, and they killed a lot of other people in the meantime. You have no business being there. You have no business being in Somalia. Hey, but Somalia's not enough? How about French airstrikes in Mali? Da-da-da-da! Oh, Mali, yeah, you know that place that the French, they love the word. They call it a colony. Oh, a colony. Oh, nice little colony. Yeah, colony. Yeah, they had it as a colony from 1892 to 1960. And now the place is up for grabs because of the breakup of Libya. That's right. They got all the arms over there, and now they're trying to overthrow the government. Yeah, that great humanitarian mission. And what is France doing? Airstrikes. They're killing innocent people. They want their colony back. They're doing deals all over the place over there. This is all about business. And talking about business, China, hey, they're the ones that do the best business in the world. Business is their game. Of a scale of 0 to 500, Beijing's air quality tops crazy bad at 755. They're killing everybody over there. Hey, it creates jobs. So what? That you have zillions of automobiles, you have burning coal, you got factories ringing the joint, and it's not only in Beijing. There's air pollution everywhere. That's all right. The poisons go into your lungs, the mercury, then it goes into your blood system, and then it kills you, and it makes room for more people to create new jobs. The weather's patterns are changing. You can't throw shit up in the air like this and not expect it to do anything. And I don't want to hear those emails either that you got the formula down and it's because of this star in that galaxy. Forecasters grist for grains. Corn wheat futures jump as USDA projects supplies will dwindle by summer. All right? I'm talking about China. Today's Wall Street Journal. Neighbors grow more weary of China. That's right. War. War is on the horizon. Russian lawmakers undertake quest to scrub civic life of foreign influence. Mr. Putin has made patriotism a central theme in his third presidential term. And the U.S. Foreign Deputy said strengthening Russia's sovereignty is now the D.U.M.B's, quote, most important direction. Then you pick up another article, Russia upgrading, strengthening military. Okay? And they're afraid of China too, and the United States. These wars are expanding. The United States is also involved in that Mali war. We're going to war. They know that this system is collapsing. And they're going to be taking more and more of our rights away from us. But you don't care. You people that have the nerve getting tight because I call some prostitute fat boy. A pig of a prostitute. Let's get this straight. Gun control's not going to solve the problem. Here, yesterday's New York Times. 50-year term for burning woman to death in elevator. Hey, they should have taken matches away from the guy. I say ban matches. It's not because he's a crazy son of a bitch. It's because of the damn matches. Ban matches. Oh, I know what we'll do. Instead of having a book of matches, we'll only have one match in a book. That's right. And no boxes of matches. That's right. Ask Fat Boy. That's not enough? After deadly fire, a man is charged with murder. The police charged a 45-year-old man with murder, arson, and attempted assault on Friday after a fire in Manhattan that left one person dead and several others injured. This man, the man, Wee Chu Wu, started the fire inside a 5-story apartment building after getting into a fight with the mother of his child, who lives in the second floor of the building. It's matches, damn it! Ban the damn matches! People don't need boxes of matches. It will be better if they only have one match so they cannot burn people in elevators or set houses on fire. I'm talking about war. Rising nationalist star sheds light on Israel's long-term drift to the right. Financial Times, drift to the right ain't so great. Oh, Netanyahu came out yesterday and said they're going to build those settlements and nobody cares. Nobody cares. The world is heading to war. And unless people push for peace, that's where we're going.
In a Turkish military base on a hill above the city of Kahramanmaraş, the German army is setting up its Patriot missile system. One by one, the rocket launchers are being directed to their designated locations. Situated 100 kilometers to the north of Turkey's southern border, their mission is to intercept and destroy ballistic missiles that may threaten the Turkish people in the area.
When you think about the NDAA, you probably think about indefinite detention of civilians without trial in military prisons, essentially the elimination of your rights as a human being. But hey, who needs rights anyway? Believe it or not, though, that's not the most scary thing in this document. Section 1063 of the National Defense Authorization Act of 2013 is titled, Report on the Capability of Conventional and Nuclear Forces Against Certain Tunnel Sites. This section directs the commander of the U.S. Strategic Command to prepare a report assessing the capability of the U.S. military to destroy a network of tunnels in China and the, quote, known hardened and deeply buried sites of foreign nations using conventional or nuclear forces. Now, what's important to realize here is that releasing such a statement publicly in a document that can easily be downloaded by China and other governments, this has to be interpreted as a provocation. But why would anyone want to make a nuclear-armed country nervous like this unless they're actually trying to set off a war?
Beijing has slammed Washington for its latest comments on China's territorial brawl with Japan in the South China Sea, saying the U.S. should be more careful with its words and stay away from the region's matters. It is a reaction to statements made by U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, who reassured Tokyo of American support and warned China against any unilateral action in the dispute. Beijing and Tokyo both lay claims to a string of uninhabited islands that are said to be rich in natural resources. For more on this, we're joined now by George Koo. He is the founder and former managing director of International Strategic Alliances. Mr. Koo, thank you very much for being with us.
Morning.
On its very basic level, Hillary Clinton was simply supporting an ally. Why are they making such a big deal out of this?
Well, historically, there's no tenuous basis for Japan to lay claim to the ownership of these islands. And the U.S. played a huge complicit part in creating this debacle to begin with. After the World War II, the terms of unconditional surrender specifically excluded any of the offshore islands as being part of Japan, but somehow the terms of surrender were changed during the peace treaty written by in San Francisco. The Chinese had no part in the forming of that treaty, and then for whatever reason in the 71-72 timeframe, the U.S. turn over, quote unquote, administrative control of the islands to Japan. And that was without any consent from China or Taiwan or the other parties concerned. So the U.S. created this mess, and I think the U.S. is continuing to prolong the problem that between Japan and China.
Now, does the U.S. even have a right to say anything? I mean, this is surely a regional matter. Now, to what extent can the U.S. try to pressure Beijing, and what kind of a reaction do they want?
Well, I think U.S. is, again, playing the strategic ambiguity game by, on the one hand, saying we're neutral about this and we're not taking sides between China and Japan. But on the other hand, they're saying, but we recognize that Japan has administrative control, and therefore we would be opposed to any unilateral action. But how did Japan get the administrative control? The U.S. turned it over to them. How did U.S. Originally get administrative control? It was because after World War II, U.S. had taken control of Okinawa, as well as the chain of islands, and including the D.U.M.B, Senkaku Islands. So from the beginning to the end, the U.S. was really responsible for this particular mess.
Now, the U.S., you say, is responsible, and President Obama has made it a clear objective to boost America's influence in the Asia-Pacific region, which is right on China's doorstep. Now, does he have the resources to compete with China and even India, for that matter?
Yeah. Well, I think the U.S. has this role of being the policeman around the world and spreading the military forces all around the world. Now, can they afford it? Well, that's a different question, because it seems like in order to meet their military budget, which is ever increasing, they're probably going to have to borrow the money, and most likely they'll be borrowing the money from the Chinese.
Now, Washington is already deeply involved in several conflicts abroad. You just mentioned this. But here they're squaring up against a nuclear power. Could this get really nasty, even possibly another Cold War?
Well, that's not I don't believe that's China's intention. I think China has been asking Japan to recognize and negotiate rather than ratcheting up the tension. Of course, Japan electing Abe is not going to help, because Abe is very well-known hawk in this particular situation. I think that the saddest part is that the Japanese people, most of the Japanese people, truly do not understand that they were the perpetrators of all the atrocious acts of World War II, and these are the residual. Instead, the Japanese government has been very successful in portraying Japan as the victim of World War II rather than the perpetrator of the aggressor, being the aggressor. And the U.S., for its own strategic reason, viewed Japan as the preferred ally, and that's what's continuing to create this friction. But I'm not sure they're gonna. I think cooler heads will come and not go to war over these little specks of island. Certainly, China has never been the aggressor in terms.
Alexander Varansa from the Institute of Oriental Studies believes China and U.S. prospective involvements with North and South Korea could lead to a global conflict.
It will be nightmare for many countries, and first of all for the 6 countries who met in six-party talks. We have the common border with Korean Peninsula, and China also. And of course, China can be involved because they have the treaty, the alliance treaty with North Korea first, and they demonstrated recently their readiness to prevent collapse of North Korea. And it will be 2 superpowers involved, United States and China. It's possible that the Third World War can start in Korean Peninsula, unfortunately.
That goes off in full in the first shot. Now you have in the submarines, you have the warheads you have not yet discharged. Those go along the way as a second wave. After that, you're pretty much out of weapons. After which, most everybody is dead. Most logistical systems are dead, non-functional. You have a situation where the effect of this kind of firing creates a continuing effect which may go for several years. Now, instead of having one bomb, which is it's a nuclear super bomb with thermonuclear implications. Now, imagine you have the same kind of thing or less, and you have not one big bomb. You have a whole barrage of such things. The exchange involves Russia, it involves China, which has a very significant thermonuclear arsenal. It implicitly involves India. It involves the United States. It involves the extermination virtually of Western Europe. And this is what Obama represents. It's what he's intended. This is the end of civilization.
And, is the price worth it?
I think this is a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it.
This is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran.
Let's take a look at the events of the past decade and see if you see a pattern. In Libya, Gaddafi was in the process of organizing a bloc of African countries to create a gold-based currency called the dinar, which they intended to use to replace the dollar in that region. US and NATO forces helped destabilize and topple the Libyan government in 2011, and after taking control of the region, US armed rebels executed Gaddafi in cold blood and immediately set up the Libyan central bank. Iran has been actively campaigning to pull oil sales off of the dollar for some time now, and it has recently secured agreements to begin trading its oil in exchange for gold. In response, the US government, with mainstream media assistance, has been attempting to build international support for military strikes on the pretext of preventing Iran from building a nuclear weapon. In the meantime, they established sanctions which US officials openly admit are aimed at causing a collapse of the Iranian economy. Syria is Iran's closest ally, and they are bound by mutual defense agreements. The country is currently in the process of being destabilized with covert assistance from NATO, and though Russia and China have warned the United States not to get involved, the White House has made statements within the past month indicating that they are considering military intervention. It should be clear that military intervention in Syria and Iran isn't being considered. It's a foregone conclusion, just as it was in Iraq and Libya. The U.S. is actively working to create the context which gives them the diplomatic cover to do what they already have planned. The motive for these invasions and covert actions becomes clear when we look at them in their full context and connect the dots. Those who control the United States understand that even if a few countries begin to sell their oil in another currency, it will set off a chain reaction and the dollar will collapse. They understand that there is absolutely nothing else holding up the value of the dollar at this point, and so does the rest of the world. But rather than accepting the fact that the dollar is nearing the end of its lifespan, the powers that be have made a calculated gambit. They have decided to use the brute force of the U.S. military to crush each and every resistant state in the Middle East and Africa. That in itself would be bad enough, but what you need to understand is that this is not going to end with Iran. China and Russia have stated publicly and on no uncertain terms that they will not tolerate an attack on Iran or Syria. Iran is one of their key allies, one of the last independent oil producers in the region, and they understand that if Iran falls, then they will have no way to escape the dollar without going to war. And yet the United States is pushing forward in spite of the warnings. What we are witnessing here is a trajectory that leads straight to the unthinkable. It's a trajectory that was mapped out years ago in full awareness of the human consequences. But who was it that put us on this course? What kind of psychopath is willing to intentionally set off a global conflict that will lead to millions of deaths just to protect the value of a paper currency? It obviously isn't the president. The decision to invade Libya, Syria, and Iran was made long before Obama had risen to the national spotlight. And yet, he's carrying out his duty just like the puppets that preceded him. So who is it that pulls the strings? Often the best answer to questions like this are found by asking another question. Qui bono? Who benefits? Obviously, those who have the power to print the dollar out of thin air have the most to lose if the dollar were to fall. And since 1913, that power has been held by the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is a private entity owned by a conglomerate of the most powerful banks in the world. And the men who control those banks are the ones who pull the strings. To them, this is just a game. Your life and the lives of those you love are just pawns on their chessboard. And like a spoiled 4-year-old who tips the board onto the floor when they start to lose, the powers that be are willing to start World War III to keep control of the global financial system. Remember that when these wars extend and accelerate. Remember that when your son or your neighbor's son comes back home in a flag-draped coffin. Remember that when they point the finger at the new boogeyman, because the madmen who are running this show will take this as far as you allow them to. So how much time do we have left? It's a question I hear constantly, but it's the wrong question. Asking how much time we have left is a passive posture. It's the attitude of a prisoner who's waiting to be taken out to a ditch and shot in the back of the head. What are our chances? Can we change course? Also the wrong question. The odds don't matter anymore. If you understand what we're facing, then you have a moral responsibility to do everything in your power to alter the course that we're on, regardless of the odds. It's only when you stop basing your involvement on the chances of success that success actually becomes possible. To strip the ill-begotten power from the financial elites and to bring these criminal cartels to justice will require nothing less than a revolution. The government is not going to save us.
Suppress the revolution of premeditated scheme, introduce a drug called crack to us ghetto teens, got along with wrong niggas now, play what it be like. like? When will niggas see they got us bleeding with 3 strikes? Can't seem to focus, hopeless. With violent thoughts I wrote this, got these devils petrified, hiding from my hocus pocus. And so I learned to earn my currency in overtime. Affiliated, clearly click a military. Soldiers attack. When I fuck my soldiers at? When my soldiers attack. Now I was born as a rebel, making trouble for the devil. Take this gangbang shit to a whole nother level. Can you feel me now? Armies in every city, definition of power. Players, are you with me? See the war is the prophecy, survival is the strategy. Rest in peace to my comrades, that's the seats. Organize the streets of time, yeah, these devils petrified of a nigga in his right mind. They tell us that we hopeless and hellbound. It's for the brothers in penitentiary jail, damn. I got you in my heart till the day I die. Think of the damage we could do if we wasn't high. Can you picture me low? It's a thug's wrath. Political contracts and bloodbaths. From a Toulouse Shakur up in the Rockets, though they got you. I never let them stop me, the struggle continued.
Now, if we do want to live the thug life and the gangster life and all of that, okay, so stop being cowards and let's have a revolution. But we don't want to do that. Dudes just want to live a character. They want to be cartoons. But if they really wanted to do something, they was that tough. All right, let's start our own country. Let's start a revolution. Let's get out of here. Let's do something.